Chapter 929. He was quiet for a while, then he took another step forward. The chilly mountain wind ruffled the hair in front of his face and then drifted down. A fierce and invisible sword intent was born with the wind and silently arrived. This time, he was quiet for an even longer time. He needed to make a choice. Would he use the star radiance in his 365 chi openings to form a star domain to resist, or would he use his sword intent to resist? In the end, he chose the latter, because Suli was his teacher on the path of the sword. Today, he naturally had to use the path of the sword to challenge his opponent. Only this could be considered a satisfactory answer sheet. Countless sword intents left their sheaths and arrived on the plateau. The chi of these sword intents were not the same, seeming rather jumbled, but miraculously, there was no conflict between them. On the contrary, they seemed exceptionally harmonious. Go Hanshi was slightly moved by this sight, a look of praise appearing in his eyes. No matter how high Qin Chongqing's cultivation in the path of the sword was, his sword intent was still not as pure as Su Li's. In terms of quality, it was very difficult for him to defeat his opponent. So he chose to use quantity to make up for the lack of quality. This seemed very ordinary, but upon closer thought, it was extremely unusual. Besides him, who else in the world could simultaneously possess so many sword intents and so freely control them? Suddenly, the plateau resounded with countless soft scraping sounds. The mountain wind abruptly vanished, but the ivy on the stone wall began to sway. The ivy that had coexisted with the sword intents for centuries was naturally unaffected by the assault of the sword intents, but now they began to break apart and fall. It was clearly impossible to see anything, but there seemed to be countless swords silently contending in front of the stone wall. Countless sword intents were engaged in the most minute contest within an extremely small area. The chi of the world grew awe-inspiring, and even the light in the sky suddenly grew much gloomier. Qin Chongqing walked up to the ivy. The ivy shattered into pieces, revealing the entrance to the path in the stone wall. Without the slightest hesitation, he walked in. The battle of sword intents was still continuing behind him. Countless cracks and white turbulence appeared in the air around the entrance to the path, obscuring the scene within. After a while, swords began to cry out from the stone wall. The path in the stone wall was very narrow, the sky extremely high above cut into a line. As Qin Chongqing walked through it, his vision was rather gloomy. The stone wall was covered in perfectly straight sword slashes, the ends extremely thin and the middle somewhat thick. They seemed very smooth and round, but they were also extremely sharp. Every sharp sword mark represented a sword intent. The sword intents emerged from the stone walls, slashing towards Qin Chongqing's face with incomparable sharpness. At the same time, they invaded his ethereal palace and sea of consciousness. Qin Chongqing didn't show any signs of panic. His footsteps were extremely steady and his sword was placed horizontally in front of his body, so close to his eyebrows that it resembled an iron chain. This was the third sword that Suli had passed onto him, the stupid sword. This sword technique focused on one's temperament. With Qin Chongqing's firm and steady temperament, when used in his hands, it could be said to be as firm as a boulder. Pa, 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 pa. Countless crisp cries of swords rang out in the stone path. It sounded like two swords were constantly colliding. In front of Qin Chongqing's eyes was the horizontal blade of the sword. The edges of the blade were filled with flying sparks and the stone walls on both sides were instantly added with dozens of new sword marks. His sword blocked the tangible sword intent, but he could not stop the invisible sword intent from invading his body. As he went deeper and deeper into the stone path, that awe-inspiring feeling grew thicker and thicker. His sea of consciousness was already surging with countless waves, which were then chopped into bubbles by those sword intents. As these bubbles appeared and then disappeared, his eyes began to feel a stabbing pain and the cutting sensation on his skin became even more distinct. These sword intents were the true test. Unless one had a firm will and a tranquil spiritual sense, it was simply impossible to endure. Chen Chongqing held his sword horizontally in front of him and continued forward. The entrance to the path was extremely narrow, but it gradually widened as he walked. But this did not mean that it was easier to walk. On the contrary, the sword marks on the stone walls grew denser and denser, the sword qi that appeared more and more majestic, the sword intense more and more awe-inspiring. Even more frightening was that the sword marks gradually formed some sort of connection, coming in an endless stream. Each sword mark was a sword, and if they could be connected, they would form a complete set of sword technique. At this moment, Chen Chongqing finally began to truly confront Su Li's cultivation in the path of the sword. An incomparably awe-inspiring sword intent seeped out of the stone walls, obscuring the sunlight above his head and that smear of green in the distance. It surged over like a vast ocean. Chen Chongqing's body swayed and he almost lost his footing. His face also paled somewhat. If he had not experienced the tempering of this ocean of sword intent countless times in the vault sheath, he would probably have already been defeated. How could he pass through this vast ocean of sword intent? How could he break Su Li's sword techniques? Chen Chongqing attentively listened to the dense sounds of sword intents tearing through the air, calmly gazing at the cracks the sword intents had left in the air, sensing the minute changes in the sword intents. His eyes were just like before, still as clean as a small stream, without a speck of dust. They reflected the flowing clouds in the sky and the sword glows flitting through them. His sword was no longer held horizontally in front of his eyes, but straight up in the air. The stupid sword could only defend, so how could he break the sword techniques Su Li had left behind? Of course, he could only use sword technique. A sword glow tore through the air, shattering a sword qi descending from the sky. This was the Heavenly Tao Academy's sword of hithering light, so fast that not even the heavens could grasp it. Several sword flowers trembled as they appeared in the mountain winds, blocking the sword of the sea and sky descending from above. The sword shadows were divided into 13, each one a willow branch. They seemed weak, but they were extremely tenacious. No matter how the sword fell into the mountain, it would still be able to endure. There was also blossoming flowers, mountain ghosts splitting the cliff, law swords murderous, revolving mountain also welcoming guests, and finally, scorching heaven rising. These were all sword styles of Mountly, so they could naturally break your Mountly sword style. There was also the Orthodox Academy's toppling mountain staff and true sword. He was the Pope and also the principal of the Orthodox Academy, so he naturally had a divine aura accompanying him. It was just like when he faced Su Yorong's sword of great light on the Bridge of Helplessness. Chen Chongqing displayed all the sword styles he had learned in his life. The sword glows illuminated the gloomy path. Countless famous, unknown, or extremely unorthodox sword techniques appeared in his hands. Time slowly passed. Chen Chongqing gripped his sword and advanced. After some time, he finally reached the end of the path. Even though countless sword glows obscured his vision and sword intents were dense and glaring, he could still clearly make out the verdant valley beyond the path. Yet it seemed like he could only walk up to this point. He had used all the sword styles he had learned in his life, but he still had not been able to break all the sword techniques on the stone wall. Only now did he understand one thing. In terms of cultivation in the path of the sword, it could be said that few people in the world could compare to him, and there was certainly no one who knew more sword styles than him. But today, he was facing Su Li. Su Li knew even more sword styles than him, and his sword intent was many times more condensed and powerful. Su Li was his teacher on the path of the sword, so how could he surpass him on the path of the sword? Chen Chongqing stopped and put down the sword in his hand. Those sword intents sensed his mood and also stopped their attack. They quietly floated in the air between the stone walls, waiting for his decision. Retreat or continue forward. Chapter 930. Those sword intents were very quiet, still not lacking in their awe-inspiring quality. Even if one used spiritual sense to sense them, one could still be injured. Shaken by the previous sword battle, a stone above the stone wall loosened and rolled down. However, it did not fall to the ground. While it was still in the air, it was cut into countless pieces by the invisible sword intent. Finally, it turned into the finest powder and was blown away by the mountain wind into the green valley outside the exit, never to be seen again. Chen Chongqing gazed at this scene in silence for a very long time. Then, he lowered his head and seriously pondered for a very long time. He was recalling those scenes of Su Li passing on the sword in the wilderness, as well as a few things that had happened later on. Before Su Li took the Holy Maiden to the Sacred Light Continent, he had left a few letters for the world. One letter had severed the last of the longevity sect's courage. One letter had cut off one of Zhu Luo's arms. These letters were naturally extremely precious and frightening objects. Chen Chongqing had obtained two. From this, one could see that Su Li truly valued him, even treating him as a legacy disciple. These two letters had saved Chen Chongqing's life twice, and at the same time, they had greatly increased his cultivation on the path of the sword. The path was now filled with sword intents, condensed and unreleased, but they were the sharpest existences in the world, capable of cutting through all things. This made him recall the scene when he had opened Su Li's letter in the kitchen of the Orthodox Academy. At the time, he had stood amidst these sword intents, not daring to move. Now, he could only remain motionless. Was this as far as he could go? Chen Chongqing suddenly recalled that before leaving, Su Li had also left a letter for Qiushan Jun. But Qiushan Jun had not taken it. Perhaps this was the gap between him and Qiushan Jun? Back in the wilderness, when Su Li had passed on the sword to him, he had said that he was very good, only a little lacking to Qiushan. When they parted in Xuanyang City, Wang Pe had also said that he was very good, only a little lacking to Qiushan. From Xining to the capital, he had heard similar words many times. At the very beginning, in the discussions of others, the gap between him and Qiushan Jun was as vast as the heavens and the earth. Later on, this gap had gradually shrunk, but even though he was now the Pope and Qiushan Jun was still an ordinary disciple of the Mountly Sword sect, and had even vanished for 5 years, there was still no one who said that he had surpassed Qiushan Jun. Chen Chongqing looked at those sword intents that were actually invisible, as if he were looking at Su Li himself. I still want to try. He wanted to see if he could take another step forward until he walked out of this stone passage. He wanted to try and prove to Su Li that his choice to pass on the sword to him was correct. He wanted to try and prove to the heavens and earth that he might not be stronger than Qiushan Jun, but he wasn't weaker than him either, at least in some aspects. Once he made up his mind, he calmed his breathing. At this moment, his state of mind was clear, like a sword that had been washed by water for countless years. Countless swords flew out of their scabbards silently, like fish leaping out of the pond, about to become dragons. Countless sword lights illuminated the gloomy cliff, taking away all the colors between heaven and earth as they slashed towards those incomparably powerful sword wills. The crisp and clear sword chimes rang out, gradually forming a line, like the line between the sea and the sky. Then, it suddenly became silent. The people on the cliff plateau had been nervously watching the movements in the passage. Green vines obstructed his line of sight, and sword wills disrupted the light in the sky. He could not clearly see what was going on inside, but he could vaguely see those sword lights. Suddenly, the sword lights flourished, making it impossible to see anything clearly. The swords clattered, making it impossible to hear anything else. All they could see was the howling of the mountain winds, stirring up countless fragments of stone and dust that constantly clashed and struggled in the passage like a living dragon. Seeing this sight and feeling the tremors coming from the cliff, those ordinary disciples of the Mountly Sword sect paled. They thought in shock, His Holiness is truly worthy of being Martial Granduncle Su Li's legacy disciple. His cultivation in the path of the sword is truly as powerful as the rumors say. Could it be that he really can make it through? Somewhat worried, Bai Kai asked, is he prepared to destroy this stone passage? After Chen Chongqing began to use his sword to break through the wall, Qiushan Jun had maintained his silence, his expression unchanged. He seemed extremely calm. Only now did a serious expression finally appear on his face for the first time. If he can destroy this stone passage, then it naturally counts as a success. This stone passage was the true cliff of Mount Li's main peak. Back then, Su Li had used an unimaginable sword might to cleave open a path, and in the several hundred years that followed, sword slashes had constantly appeared on the stone walls. Sword intent had seeped into the cliff, making it incomparably tough. Even the treasures of the orthodoxy would find it very difficult to destroy, so Chen Chongqing naturally did not have this ability. But he walked out. After an unknown period of time, he finally walked out of the stone tunnel and arrived at the meadow outside the exit. His clothes were riddled with holes, and his hairband had been torn at some point. His black hair scattered behind his back, making him seem rather miserable. Blood flowed out of his clothes, but it gradually faded with a gentle breeze. Fortunately, after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, he had already grasped a few techniques, preventing any strange changes from occurring. He was born without filth, his spiritual sense tranquil and powerful to the extreme, his meditation efficiency extremely high, his star radiance abundant. He had bathed in the true blood of the Black Frost Dragon while in meditation, and when he condensed his star domain, he had simultaneously lit up 365 chi openings. It could be said that he possessed the world's most perfect cultivating body. But today, he had suffered so many injuries. Besides his body covered in sword slashes, his face also had several extremely fine wounds, and a small part of his left eyebrow had been cut off. If the wound had been just a little off, it would have injured his eye. From this, one could imagine just how dangerous the situation had been, and just how terrifying the sword intents Su Li had left on the stone walls had been. Standing on the stone path, and gazing at the verdant valley and cloudless blue sky, Chen Chongqing felt extremely carefree. Today, when confronting the sword intents Su Li had left behind, he had displayed everything he had learned in his life. He had held nothing back, had no need to hide anything. This was not the most dangerous battle he had ever fought in his cultivation, but it was the most delightful battle. Countless sword styles had been displayed to their heart's content, cleaving apart the stone path and the world, and also broadening his mind. He even wanted to yell a few times at the verdant valley and blue sky. But this was somewhat inconsistent with his personality. In the end, he did not yell, but turned to look at the stone path. He had already walked past the stone path, so he naturally knew that not all the sword intents and moves on the stone walls had been left behind by Su Li when he broke open the heavenly passage. Many of them had been left behind by Su Li later on, and some had probably been left behind by the people of the Mount Li sword sect. He looked at the stone path in silence for a very long time. He seemed to see a few scenes. In the past several hundred years, Su Li would occasionally return to the mountain, and he would come here and seemingly casually slash at the stone walls. Those elders of the sword hall with profound cultivations in the path of the sword would hold their swords and think hard, all for the sake of advancing a step further. Occasionally, they would gain something and also slash at the stone path. In the past several hundred years, the essence of Su Li's path of the sword was contained here, as was the spirit and will of the Mount Li sword sect. This stone path was the place that the disciples of the Mount Li sword sect used to temper their sword hearts. When Su Li had left his daughter in this verdant valley, he had assuredly thought that Chen Chongqing and Zhixiu would try to walk this stone path. In other words, this was the final lesson he had left for Chen Chongqing. Chapter 931. What about Zhixiu? Chen Chongqing thought to himself, could it be that Su Li had forced Zhixiu to walk this stone path brimming with sword intent just to teach him a lesson? Or perhaps this was the father-in-law's test for his son-in-law. My father isn't as good as you think. He just doesn't want Zhishyo to see me. In reality, he definitely didn't think that you would actually be able to force your way through. Hearing the noise, Chen Chongqing turned around. Then he saw Qi Jian, whom he had not seen for many years. That year in the Mausoleum of Books and later in the Garden of Zhou, he had gotten to know Qi Jian as a thin, small, and somewhat timid little boy. As a result, even though he had long since known of her true identity, when he saw her dressed in a blue dress, it still took him a very long time to come to his senses. Long time no see. Chen Chongqing said to her. Qi Jian pushed her messy hair behind her ear and said, "How many years has it been? I don't know the passage of time in the mountains, and I'm too lazy to remember the days." The current her was a cheerful young girl, even healthier than when she was young. She didn't have the gloomy feeling that Chen Chongqing had previously imagined. Chen Chongqing looked around and found that the green valley was lush with vegetation. In the distance there was a waterfall and a pool of water. The sound of birds chirping was incessant and the scenery was extremely beautiful. But even if he was in the celestial realm, being imprisoned here all year round was extremely bitter. As he thought of this matter and listened to her words, his dissatisfaction with Su Li and all of Mount Li grew even stronger. Seeing his expression, Qi Jian softly said, "Your Holiness the Pope, have you perhaps misunderstood something?" Chen Chongqing was slightly startled and asked, "Are you not imprisoned here?" Qi Jian said, "These past few years, I have indeed been quietly cultivating my sword techniques here." Chen Chongqing said, "Then why do you need to explain for your sect? It's not easy to get in and out of this place." Thinking of the dangerous sword wills in the stone wall and the mountain gate, he still had a lingering fear. If he had to endure this kind of test every day, no matter how beautiful the scenery was, he would not be willing to come here. Qi Jian knew that he was concerned about him and smiled. "Other than what you did, there are naturally other ways." Chen Chongqing was slightly startled. He thought to himself, "Is there another way out?" He asked, "Then can you go out now?" "He's over there." Qi Jian's smile faded, and he calmly and firmly said, "If he really wants to see me, he can naturally come and see me." Chen Chongqing vaguely understood the meaning of this sentence, but he couldn't be sure. The dragon-like smoke and dust gradually dispersed. The sunlight shone on the cliff platform again, and the stone path returned to true quietness. Everyone's expression was slightly apprehensive. They didn't know what was going on inside. Zhishyo gazed in that direction, silent and pensive. Qiushan Jun said, "He went over." Hearing this, Guan Feibai glanced at the sky and revealed an expression of shock. "It only took 3/4 of an hour?" Tang 36 didn't know how difficult the stone path was, but seeing Guan Feibai's reaction, he knew that Chen Chongqing used very little time. Tang 36 said proudly, "Don't you think that his sword art was personally taught by your martial grand-uncle? This stone path is nothing to him." Bai Kai sneered, "When eldest brother crossed this stone path 5 years ago, it only took him half an hour." At these words, Zhishyo glanced at Qiushan Jun. Tang 36 was also somewhat shocked. Qiushan Jun's reputation had long ago spread throughout the world, but very few people had ever seen him fight, not even Zhishyo or Tang 36. In truth, they had always wanted to know. Everyone said that Qiushan Jun was very strong, but just how strong was he? That shout in Wenshui City, and those paintings on Holy Maiden Peak proved that Qiushan Jun truly was extraordinary, but in the end it was not cultivation or battle. Only now did they realize that this person truly was very strong. 5 years ago, Qiushan Jun was a little younger than Chen Chongqing, and his cultivation was probably slightly inferior, but he had actually used half an hour to cross this stone path? Go Hanshi said, "Senior brother has been learning the sword in the mountains since he was a child. This isn't his first time attempting the path of the sword, so he naturally has to take advantage." The Mountly Sword sect disciples knew of their second brother's style of conduct, so they were not surprised to see him speak up for Chen Chongqing. Instead, it was Tang 36 who didn't know how to respond. Zhixiu paid no attention to their conversation and walked straight towards the stone path. The sword and tents seeping out of the vines from the stone walls drifted down onto his body, instantly ripping apart his clothes. But he did not care, his expression not even changing. The gazes of the Mountly Sword sect disciples and Tang 36 all fell on his body. Many people had already guessed that Chen Chongqing would probably be able to cross this stone path, because he had originally cultivated the path of the Sword of Mountly. Then what about this wolf expert who had been infamous for his viciousness since he was a child? He was the true main character of this matter. To Chen Chongqing, crossing this stone path was a battle. To Zhixiu, crossing this stone path was a hunt. From a certain perspective, his body truly did have a very primitive aura. As a hybrid of human and demi-human, his body was as tough as steel, his talent for comprehension was extremely high, his intelligence was extremely high, his spiritual sense was extremely powerful, and his true essence was abundant. As the strange illness of the tide rush of blood worsened, his meridians grew thicker and thicker, his spiritual sense more berserk, and the amount of true essence in his body increased steeply. Just like some monsters in the plains of the north, when they were on the verge of death, they would become incomparably powerful. Zhixiu was currently very powerful, and when Chen Chongqing crossed the stone path, he was like a true beast, constantly observing, not missing a single detail. He had confirmed that he had found his prey's weakness, so he needed to conserve all his strength and unnecessary consumption, lunge forward and bite through his opponent's throat. Pulling away the ivy, he walked into the stone path. He gazed at the sword and tent that blotted out the heavens and earth, but he did not assume any fighting stance. He said, "I didn't come to learn the sword from you, nor do I want to prove that I'm stronger than you. I just came to see her, and no one can stop me." These words were said to the sword slashes on the stone wall. Naturally, he wanted to say them to the owner of the sword slashes. Countless sword cries soared into the sky, seeming to be extremely angry, but not long after, these sword cries disappeared. The stone path was quiet. Whether it was Tang 36 and the others on the plateau or Chen Chongqing on the other side of the cliff, they were all extremely nervous. After waiting for a very long time, there were no more sword cries. Chen Chongqing understood and said, "This is the method?" Qi Jian calmly said, "The sword is connected to the spirit and cannot be tricked. As long as the heart is sincere, it can send a message. Since it's not an enemy, why stop me?" Chen Chongqing said, "Then what about the sword cries from before? They seemed even more berserk than the ones I encountered." Qi Jian slightly pursed his lips. He seemed unconcerned, but in reality, he was very nervous. The footsteps grew closer and closer. Zhixiu walked out of the stone path. Chapter 932. Zhixiu's appearance was even more miserable than Chen Chongqing's. His body that was as hard as metal and stone was covered in wounds and dust. Chen Chongqing took a handkerchief from his sleeve and handed it over. He curiously asked, "How did you get here?" Zhixiu expressionlessly replied, "I didn't retaliate when hit, didn't retaliate when cursed, just walked forward." Chen Chongqing asked, "You could even do that?" Zhixiu replied, "Or he could just kill me." Chen Chongqing said, "That doesn't match your personality." Zhixiu replied, "It can be changed." Ever since he was a child, he had been viewed as a demon and expelled from his tribe. He struggled between life and death, struggling to survive. Zhixiu had never been a person who cared about the gazes of others, and he certainly didn't know how to write the word flexible. His personality was cold and hard to the extreme. But for some things, he was willing to change himself, even if he had to go against his heart and his most powerful habit. For example, at this moment, He took the handkerchief from Chen Chongsheng and earnestly wiped the dirt off his face. After a while, he very seriously asked Chen Chongsheng, "Have you wiped it clean?" Chen Chongsheng looked for a while, then said, "It's not bad." Zhixiu glanced at his clothes that had been torn by sword intent and said, "I know that you carry a lot of clothes with you. Lend me a set." When I had nothing to do, I made a few sets of clothes. In a little while you can see if they fit. Qi Jian's voice came from behind Chen Chongsheng. Her voice was very soft, trembling. Chen Chongsheng stepped aside. Zhixiu froze at the sight of the girl dressed in a blue dress. Qi Jian looked at him, somewhat nervous. All was quiet. It had been many years since they had last met. Somewhat unfamiliar. Somewhat unaccustomed. He was still the same. She had already become a big girl. Qi Jian raised her skirt and bowed. As Su Li's daughter, the sect master's last disciple, she was the junior sister with the most special status in Mount Li. She very rarely bowed to people, so her movements were rather clumsy. Zhixiu clasped his hands in return, his movements even more stiff, as he had never bowed to anyone before. The atmosphere was also rather stiff. The two were quiet for a very long time, not knowing what to say. "I don't have much time," Zhixiu suddenly said. Qi Jian knew that his condition was worsening, so she couldn't help but feel a little angry. But Zhixiu continued, "So I want to treasure my time even more." Startled, Qi Jian asked, "What do you want to do?" Zhixiu looked at her and earnestly said, "I want to hug you." Qi Jian's face turned red, not knowing how to respond. Zhixiu somewhat clumsily spread out his arms. Qi Jian wanted to cry and said, "I want you to carry me." Zhixiu turned around and squatted down in front of her. Qi Jian leaned in, hugged his neck tightly, and then began to cry. "Don't cry." Zhixiu felt uneasy. Qi Jian felt wronged and said, "I want to cry." Zhixiu thought about it, then asked, "Where do you live?" Qi Jian was a bit nervous, asking, "What are you going to do?" Zhixiu said, "Didn't you say you made me a few new sets of clothes?" Qi Jian leaned against his back and softly snorted. "Who said I made clothes for you?" Zhixiu smiled, but said nothing. Qi Jian said in a low voice, "Southern Wilderness, Zhen star position." For Li. Zhixiu stared blankly, then slowly closed his eyes. He ran in that direction with her on his back. It was a large grassland. Under the sunlight, it looked like a wheat field, suffused with golden waves. It looked just like that grassland in the garden of Zhou. After Chen Chongsheng retreated, he did his utmost to keep quiet so as not to disturb them. But soon after, he realized that he was worrying too much, because Zhixiu and Qi Jian clearly only had eyes for each other and no one else. Or else how could Zhixiu, famed for his vigilance, not have heard the dense footsteps and voices of people? Qiushan Jun, Tang 36, and the others walked through the stone path and arrived at Chen Chongsheng's side. Just as Qi Jian had said, there were many ways to pass through this stone path, and the disciples of the Mount Li sword sect naturally had ways to calm the sword intense. When they arrived, they just happened to see Zhixiu clumsily spreading out his arms, wanting to embrace Qi Jian. Tang 36 laughed. "Is this guy trying to pretend to be Xian Yuan Pe?" Qiushan Jun arched his brows. Go Hanshi shook his head. Guan Feibai's face was as cold as ice. Liang Banhu silently creased his brow. Bai Kai almost cursed. His little junior sister, who had grown up in the palm of his hand, was suddenly about to be embraced by another man. Anyone who saw this scene would be in a rather foul mood. Even if it was a gentle gentleman like Go Hanshi or someone as lofty and far-sighted as Qiushan Jun. Zhixiu carried Qi Jian on his back as he ran down the valley. The faces of Guan Feibai and the others softened a little. Chen Chongsheng walked over and said to Qiushan Jun, "Thank you." Qiushan Jun pointed down the valley and said, "If this is the case, then forget it." There was naturally sympathy and tenderness for his junior sister, especially for him, but to say that he truly wanted this pair of lovers to get married was also a lie. So he said forget it. But Chen Chongsheng was not talking about this matter. I heard that before Senior Suli left, he wanted to leave you a letter, but you did not accept it. Chen Chongqing said, just now, when I was crossing the stone path, I understood its meaning. Qiushan Jun said, there was no deeper meaning to my actions. I just didn't like Marshal Granduncle's conduct that day and was rather annoyed, so I did not accept it. After a moment of silence, Chen Chongqing said, Senior's conduct truly was rather irresponsible. I also didn't like it. Everyone says that I'm very similar to Senior Suli. Presumably, if I met him, I would definitely like him. Tang 36 regretfully said, it's a pity that we didn't have the chance to meet, or else Senior would definitely have passed on some good things to me. Guan Feibai sneered, why don't you go look in the mirror? Tang 36 arched his brows. Every morning when I wake up, I look in the mirror. I'm very spirited and handsome. Could it be that your Marshal Granduncle was born very ugly? When it came to making jokes, not even all the disciples of the Mountly Sword sect added together would be a match for him. Go Hanshi indicated for Guan Feibai to say no more, then said to Chen Chongqing, His Holiness the Pope used the sword to break the Tao. According to the rules, you can now be considered a member of my Mountly. If an ordinary cultivator of the world could be considered a disciple of the strongest Mountly Sword sect, they would naturally be more than happy to do so. But Chen Chongqing was no ordinary person, and his status was extremely noble. Not even the sect master of the Mountly Sword sect could compare. Go Hanshi's words had no other meaning. He was just informing Chen Chongqing. In his view, Chen Chongqing naturally would not accept it. This was truly the case. Chen Chongqing had no conflict with the Mountly Sword sect. In the past few years, the two sides had been deeply involved, and he and Go Hanshi and the other disciples of the younger generation were rather congenial. It was just that as the Pope, no matter what, he could not enter the Mountly Sword sect, or else what would the priests of the Li Palace do? Chen Chongqing said, we've always walked the same path, so we're naturally of the same sect. Go Hanshi praised, these words have true meaning. Just at this moment, Qi Jian's happy laughter came from the plains outside the valley. Seeing that extremely clear line of dust on the plains and those two figures in front of them, the crowd all sighed with emotion. Chen Chongqing and Qiushan Jun shook their heads and said in unison, I also don't know just what that fellow is thinking. With these words, the entire crowd fell silent. Everyone knew that the fellow they were speaking of was Suli, but the silence was not because of the disrespect in these words. Go Hanshi looked at Chen Chongqing and Qiushan Jun with a slightly surprised expression and said, the two of you have quite a tacit understanding. The rest of the people were also looking at them. Chen Chongqing and Qiushan Jun glanced at each other, then very tacitly turned around and said no more. Chapter 933. On the same night, the Mountly Sword sect arranged a banquet in the valley, using a bonfire to roast meat. To someone of the Pope's status, this sort of reception was unavoidably rather disrespectful. Chen Chongqing had no objections. He knew that this was because Qi Jian was rather shy and unwilling to leave the valley to face too many of his fellow disciples. Moreover, roasting meat over a bonfire had its own wild charm, and he very much liked it. But when he thought back to the scene of him roasting meat and drinking wine in Sloping Cliff Horse Farm and realized that Qiushan Jun was not present, he felt rather complicated. Tang 36 was holding a bowl of wine and talking to Yi Xiaolian, making the girl tremble in amusement. Go Hanshi and Hu 32 were sitting together, whispering to each other. They were probably planning some important matters for the future. Guan Feibai, Bai Kai, and the others were sitting next to Chen Chongqing, motionlessly staring across from them. On the other side of the bonfire, Zhixiu and Qi Jian sat together. Qi Jian was leaning against his shoulder, the smile on his small face seeming particularly happy in the light of the fire. Zhixiu's new clothes were also very eye-catching. It could be seen that the craftsman had only been average, but the stitching was very dense, indicating that a great deal of thought and effort had been put into it. Chen Chongqing was very gratified by this sight. Guan Feibai and the others were naturally in a terrible mood and quickly left the valley, with Yi Xiaoyan following them. In the dead of night, the bonfire hissed in the wind. Qi Jian was leaning against Zheshio's shoulder, softly humming a little tune. Chen Chongqing looked around, and with a thought, he brought Nank out of the garden of Zhou. Seeing Nank suddenly appear by the bonfire, Qi Jian was rather nervous and subconsciously gripped the hilt of the sword at her waist. "You should call her little aunt." "There's no need to be so nervous," Chen Chongqing said. Qi Jian froze for a moment before understanding the meaning of these words. She looked at Nank's face, her emotions rather complex. Tang 36's gaze moved back and forth between Nank and Qi Jian, ultimately resting on Chen Chongqing. "It feels like this seniority is a bit messy." Chen Chongqing ignored him and expressed his intentions to Qi Jian. For a period of time, Nank would also be living in Mount Li. He hoped that Qi Jian could help take care of her. Qi Jian confirmed that this was a matter that the sect master had tacitly agreed to, so he naturally would not refuse. Leaving Nank in the Mount Li sword sect was Chen Chongqing's decision after careful consideration. The first was for Nank's safety. Wuqiong Bai's question from Holy Maiden Peak was still ringing in his ears, and if she left his side, only the Mount Li sword sect had the ability and was willing to take in this demon princess. In addition, the Mount Li sword sect's righteous sword Pure Heart would also be of some assistance to Nank's recovery. One was a cure and two were also a cure. In any case, Zheshio wanted to stay in Mount Li to treat his illness, so he might as well have Nank treat him as well. As Chen Chongqing and Qi Jian spoke, Nank stared blankly at him. She did not understand why he wanted to separate from her. Just like in the last few days, she grabbed his clothes, but this time, she would. Looking at her eyes, Chen Chongqing's mood was somewhat downcast, but he had no choice but to softly coax her for a long time before Nank finally let go. Qi Jian had been watching this entire time. Hearing this, Chen Chongqing was stunned. Tang 36's laughter traveled to the depths of the grassland outside of the Green Valley and startled countless night birds. "My dad definitely doesn't want to call you brother-in-law." Qi Jian glanced at Nank sitting quietly at Chen Chongqing's side and said, "Can you not be like this?" Chen Chongqing had always had a gentle personality, but he could no longer hold back his displeasure. "Just what did I do? I didn't do anything." Qi Jian said, "You understand what I'm saying." Zheshio said, "What she means is, don't treat other girls too well." Tang 36 said, "Do you think that Chen Chongqing doesn't understand?" "He clearly understands, which is why he became angry out of humiliation." After taking care of matters at Mount Li, Chen Chongqing and the others bid farewell on the morning of the next day and returned the way they had come. Even now, no one knew what problem had occurred in White Emperor City. A shadow had always been cast over his heart, and he was very worried. He and Su Yorong had agreed to meet in the small village at the base of Holy Maiden Peak. He was confident that the latest news would arrive at that time. When the time came, they would decide what to do next. The morning light had just fallen on the Green Mountain, and the wind over the Tong River was still somewhat chilly. Chen Chongqing gazed at the small village across the river. He knew that Su Yorong had probably already arrived, and his mood improved slightly. At this moment, the cry of a goose came from the sky. A red goose transformed into a red line as it broke through the clouds in the north and landed in front of him. Hu 32 untied the letter tube tied to the red goose's leg and, according to the method agreed upon, removed the seal, took out a letter, and placed it in front of Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing's expression did not change as he read the densely packed words on the letter, but everyone could sense that he was rather nervous and angry. The grass on the banks of the Tong River was covered in a thin layer of frost, just like the emotions in his eyes. Chen Chongqing took a piece of paper and scribbled a few words. He had Yi Xiaoyan give it to Su Yorong on the other side of the river, saying, "I have urgent matters to attend to, so I will leave first." After saying this, he no longer hesitated. He boarded the carriage that the Southern Taoist Church had prepared and rode along the official road on the western shore of the Tong River to the north. Yi Xiaoyan had no idea what had happened, but when she crossed the river and saw Su Yorong, she couldn't help but feel a little uneasy as she handed over the letter. Su Yorong already knew what had happened, so she was not angry at Chen Chongqing's sudden departure. However, when she saw the words on the letter, she couldn't help but feel a little displeased. "If you want to go, then go. I won't say anything, but riding my crane to see some other girl is a little too much." Following the Tong River to the north and exiting the eastern foothills of the Luomei Mountains, Chen Chongqing's party arrived at the southernmost county of the Great Zhou dynasty, Runan County. By the time the carriage entered the Prince of Runan's estate, the sun had just risen over the treetops. From this, one could see just how urgent the journey had been. Tang 36 and Hu 32 both felt exhausted to the extreme, but at the same time, curious to the extreme. Ever since Chen Chongqing had left Sloping Cliff Horse Farm, someone had been sending him letters. All the arrangements of the Li Palace were related to these letters, so just who was the one writing them? Why was Chen Chongqing so obedient, and what was the content of this letter that made Chen Chongqing so anxious? It even made them recall what had happened in Fengyang City when Chen Chongqing learned of the change in Holy Maiden Peak. To Chen Chongqing, just who in the world had the same status as Su Yorong? Upon reaching the depths of the Prince of Runan's estate, Tang 36 and Hu 32 found no answer. Moreover, the one waiting for them was not the Prince of Runan, but the Prince of Luoyang. This most useless prince of the Chen clan seemed extremely exhausted, his body covered in dust. He had probably just arrived from the north. Upon seeing Chen Chongqing walk in, the Prince of Luoyang hurriedly paid his respects, kneeling on the ground and raising his but high in the air. Chapter 934. Tang 36 felt a little strange at this sight. Even if Chen Chongqing was the Pope, even if this prince was more cowardly and cowardly, why did he need to make such a grand bow? Chen Chongqing gazed at the Prince of Luoyang's clumsy movements and cumbersome body in a daze. For some reason, he did not immediately have the prince rise. Tang 36 once more felt that something was wrong. It was clear that there was something wrong with Chen Chongqing's attitude toward this prince. Amongst the princes of the Chen clan, the Prince of Luoyang could be said to be the most inconspicuous and honest. No matter how fierce the conflict between the imperial court and the orthodoxy, he had always treated the Li Palace with the utmost respect. The scene from before had proved this point. Logically speaking, given Chen Chongqing's personality and conduct, even if he was not particularly intimate with this prince, he should not have been so cold. Not hearing Chen Chongqing's voice, the Prince of Luoyang appeared extremely uneasy. Sweat poured down his face as he gave Tang 36 a pitiful glance. Tang 36 lightly poked Chen Chongqing's back with his finger. Chen Chongqing finally came to his senses and hurriedly had the Prince of Luoyang rise. The Prince of Luoyang gave a clear sigh of relief. He hurriedly took out a very thin letter from his bosom and carefully offered it to Chen Chongqing as if it was a family heirloom. Hu 32 looked at the cover of the letter and confirmed that it was not the usual letter or the letter from this morning. So who had written this letter? The intricate decorations on the window seemed real, and the light coming in from outside was much dimmer, making it rather gloomy. Chen Chongqing looked at the seal on the letter, paused for a few moments, and then very skillfully opened it. The handwriting on the letter had not been seen for many years, but it was still familiar, just like the writer. The strokes were smooth and flowing, like a stream flowing outside the village. It seemed elegant and charming, but it was actually a hidden strength of character, like a solitary peak in the mist. Chen Chongqing's face darkened when he saw the first line. The contents of the letter he had received this morning were indeed true. He frowned and never loosened his frown. Tang 36 and Hu 32 looked at him, questioning him with their eyes. "This is a letter that teacher wrote to me," Chen Chongqing said. The two were shocked speechless at this answer. The Prince of Luoyang was constantly wiping away his cold sweat. The room was quiet, not a single sound coming from the Prince of Runan's estate. The imperial court and the Li Palace, the master-disciple relationship between Shang Xingzhou and Chen Chongqing, had been in a stalemate for several years. The situation was extremely tense. Suddenly, Shang Xingzhou sent him a personal letter. What was he trying to do? Of course, it was impossible that he had decided to bury the hatchet with his student just because he had drunk 2 pots of wine last night and wanted to take a look at the moon of the demons in the north. This could only mean that something very important had happened on the continent. This matter was even more important than the war between the orthodoxy and the imperial court. It was so important that even someone as cold and powerful as Shang Xingzhou had no choice but to temporarily put aside his issues with Chen Chongqing and even ask him for help. Shang Xingzhou's letter was very concise, and Chen Chongqing very quickly finished reading it. He thanked the Prince of Luoyang for his hard work. The Prince of Luoyang was very happy, but he didn't know what to do next, so he stood there in a daze. Tang 36 gave him a look. The Prince of Luoyang reacted and hurriedly bowed as he withdrew. After he left, Tang 36 immediately asked, "What happened?" Chen Chongqing said, "White Emperor City is going to hold the Heavenly Selection Ceremony." Tang 36 felt that the name Heavenly Selection Ceremony was rather familiar, but he had forgotten where he had seen it before, so he didn't know what it meant. Hu 32's expression suddenly changed as he harshly said, "Preposterous. Just what is the demi-human race thinking?" Only after Hu 32's explanation did Tang 36 understand the meaning of the Heavenly Selection Ceremony, and his expression turned grave. "Princess Luolua's betrothed partner will be the next White Emperor?" "Correct." Tang 36 turned to Chen Chongqing and asked, "Didn't you take care of her meridians? Why can't she inherit the position of the White Emperor?" Chen Chongqing was quiet for a few moments, then replied, "There's naturally someone who doesn't want her to become the next White Emperor." Tang 36 understood who he was speaking of and asked in confusion, "Madame Mu is her mother. What benefit does this have for her?" Hu 32 was concerned with another question. "Who does Madame Mu intend to marry Princess Luoluo?" Chen Chongqing thought of the contents of the morning letter and said, "There are many rumors in White Emperor City. It seems that it should be the second prince of the Great Western Continent. The imperial clan of the Great Western Continent truly does not give up on their evil intentions." Hu 32 harshly said, "The blue-clothed visitor died just 2 days ago, and now they're using this sort of trick. Madame Mu has been married to the White Emperor for several centuries, and it's rumored that the two have always been in love. Who could have imagined that she would still wholeheartedly care about her paternal clan, even wanting to take away the benefits of her own daughter? In the past, I thought that only those uncivilized remote villages would have such foolish women, but I truly didn't expect." Tang 36 was filled with loathing. Hu 32 asked in confusion, "Will the White Emperor agree to her actions?" Chen Chongqing replied, "His Majesty the White Emperor remains in seclusion. No one knows his stance." Tang 36 suddenly felt that something was wrong. The shadow of the imperial court and Shang Xingzhou was clearly behind the schemes of the Great Western Continent. To put it another way, this had always been an attempt by Shang Xingzhou and Madame Mu to get rid of Chen Chongqing. If Madame Mu wanted to use this marriage alliance to allow the Great Western Continent's imperial clan to successfully disembark, Shang Xingzhou would be happy to see it happen. Why was he so fiercely opposing it? Shang Xingzhou had naturally written a letter to Chen Chongqing in the hope that he would ruin the grand ceremony of returning to the origin. Chen Chongqing was naturally the best candidate to stop the marriage alliance between White Emperor City and the Great Western Continent, as he had a sufficiently revered status and a very special relationship with the demi-human race. In this matter, he could play an even greater role than Shang Xingzhou. The problem was that Shang Xingzhou was the de facto #1 person in the world, and Chen Chongqing was the student that he most wanted to kill. The relationship between the two was abnormally complex, and he had assuredly spent a very long time in writing this letter to Chen Chongqing. It had not been easy at all, and the more difficult it was, the more it showed just how intense his stance on the matter was. Why was his stance so intense that he was even willing to ask for help from his own student, even if he might have to make some concessions to his student afterwards? Black Robe is currently not in Shuilao City. Chen Chongqing added, moreover, 20-some days ago, the Demon Palace held a ceremony to the stars. It caused an enormous stir, but I don't know what happened. Hu 32 understood, and his complexion paled. Tang 36's expression also turned abnormally grave. If Shang Xingzhou's judgment was correct, the human race was about to face its most dangerous situation since the siege of Luoyang 1,000 years ago. Everyone was saying that Luoluo might be married off to the great Western continent's second prince, but what if she wasn't? What if White Emperor City's marriage partner was someone else? What if that person came from the north? Chapter 935. Tang 36 looked into Chen Chongqing's eyes and very seriously asked, "You believe in your teacher?" Chen Chongqing replied, "Master is exceptionally intelligent and has keen insight. Not even Black Robe can conceal all the secrets of the heavens, so I believe in his judgment." Tang 36 said, "You know that's not what I mean." Chen Chongqing fell quiet for a while, then said, "To Master, killing me and subduing the orthodoxy are the most important matters, but exterminating the demons and having the human race unite the continent is his lifelong wish, his lifelong pursuit. In this aspect, I have absolute trust in him." In the history of the continent, the most important change was the alliance between the human race and the demi-human race. It was precisely because of this that Emperor Taizong was able to lead the allied armies of the two races on a successful northern expedition, driving the demons back to the snowy wastelands. In the following several centuries, the human race obtained enough time to rest and build up strength, making it so that the demons found it difficult to advance south. If the demi-human race suddenly broke their agreement with the human race and switched sides, what would happen? Shang Xingzhou and Chen Chongqing did not have a conflict of ideals, but a conflict of Daos. Chen Chongqing was the only flaw in Shang Xingzhou's Dao, so Shang Xingzhou had to think of a way to erase his existence. But compared to this major event, this was nothing. Just as Shang Xingzhou had said in his letter, White Emperor City could not be lost. A rare solemn expression appeared on Tang 36's face. Then we must prevent this from happening. Fortunately, all this was just a guess, not yet true. The human race still had time to react. If not for Shang Xingzhou's extremely sharp perception of these problems and his extremely daring judgment, the situation would have become extremely terrible. When he thought of this, even though they were on different sides, Tang 36 still found it hard to suppress his admiration for this venerable Taoist. Chen Chongqing walked to the window and raised the stainless sword. He silently used the intellectual sword to calculate for a long time, but he still did not obtain a definite answer. The demi-human race, is it really possible for them to ally with the demons? In the history books, the conflict between the demi-human race and the demons was stained with blood and the tragic fate of the demi-human race. Logically speaking, the demon race would never forget those grudges, let alone ally with the demon race. Hu 32 said, "In truth, this matter isn't completely impossible. Don't forget, 1,000 years ago the relationship between the humans and demi-humans was also very bad. If the demons were willing to pay a sufficient price to quell the hatred of the demi-humans really might side with them." Tang 36 said, "The problem is the motive. If Madame Mu is willing to take this risk for the sake of the great Western continent, would the demi-human lords, ministers, and generals agree?" Hu 32's gaze fell on the letter in Chen Chongqing's hand. Perhaps this is the reason. Tang 36 also looked over, but he didn't understand. The demon race has been in decline for 1,000 years. Even if a new monarch ascends to the throne, it will be impossible for them to return to the terrifying strength of the past in a short period of time. But our human race has become more and more powerful in these 1,000 years. Just like what the blue-clothed visitor said on the summit, we have too many geniuses and experts. Hu 32 looked at Chen Chongqing and seriously said, "My lady said before that the venerable Taoist wholeheartedly wants to carry on Emperor Taizong's dying wish and exterminate the demons to unite the world. When the time comes, what will the demi-humans do? Submit and pay tribute, or become slaves of the demons like in ancient times?" Tang 36 said, "The current White Emperor is the hegemon of his generation. Does he not even have this much confidence?" Hu 32 was quiet for a while, then said, "In these last few years, the entire continent has been talking about a phrase." Chen Chongqing was taken aback. "What phrase?" Hu 32 said, "One temple of Xining rules the world." Chen Chongqing fell silent, as did Tang 36. The meaning of this phrase was crystal clear. It referred to the story of the past 10-some years, as well as the current period of history. So if one looked into the distance, what would one see? If Shang Xingzhou and Chen Chongqing reconciled, and together with the emperor, who on the continent would be a match for the human race? Even the White Emperor would feel an intense apprehension and unease when he looked at this master and disciple trio from Xining Village's temple. It might have been fine if this was an impossible matter, but many people believed that the problem between Shang Xingzhou and Chen Chongqing should never have existed. An important figure like the White Emperor might even believe that the standoff between Shang Xingzhou and Chen Chongqing was a hoax created by this master and disciple. Chen Chongqing did not respond to Hu 36's gaze. His gaze fell on the letter. At the end of the letter, Shang Xingzhou had written 4 words: "Wait and see." "If one wanted to watch, one had to be present," he said. "Let's first take care of this matter." Hu 32 replied, "Of course, but I don't know when White Emperor City will hold the heavenly selection ceremony. Since the Li Palace is acting, the Orthodoxy's diplomatic mission should be formed as quickly as possible." Chen Chongqing said, "The time for the heavenly selection ceremony has probably not been set, but White Emperor City's thoughts are very clear. Even if they can't hide this matter forever, they won't want us to suddenly interfere, so they won't give us time to make arrangements. Thus, I will go first, and the diplomatic mission will follow soon after." Hu 32 said, "Understood." Tang 36 said, "I'll first return to Wenshui." A large portion of the demi-human business was handled by the Tang clan, and Wenshui City had always had a good relationship with White Emperor City. This matter involved the future of the human race, so the Tang Old Master naturally could not stay out of it. He would probably make some corresponding arrangements. Chen Chongqing nodded. "Then I'll go first." At this moment, the clear cry of a crane came from the prince's estate. The winter winds howled and the trees in the courtyard swayed as a white crane descended. The Prince of Luyang was kneeling in the distant porch, respectfully sending Chen Chongqing off. Tang 36 finally couldn't help but ask, "Why did the venerable Taoist have His Highness deliver this letter?" Chen Chongqing replied, "His Highness spent last night in Mount Shao, so he was closest to this place." Tang 36 thought to himself, "This is clearly illogical. If the imperial court wanted to send a letter, whether it was by Red Eagle, Red Goose, or a ray, they could all reach the Prince of Runan's estate. There was no need for the Prince of Luyang to make this trip." Chen Chongqing knew that he could not persuade him, so after a moment of silence, he said, "Master knows that I trust him more." Tang 36 was even more confused, thinking, "Why do you trust this prince famed for being a good-for-nothing?" Chen Chongqing explained no more and mounted the crane. 1 man and 1 crane flew up into the clouds. The Tong River had become an indistinguishable strip, and the Luomei Mountains were like a bonsai to the left behind. Clouds and mist could be faintly seen in the extreme west, the Green Mountains in the distance. Who knew what awaited him? The Green Mountains and the sea of clouds looked like the fog on the other side of the lake, but also like the smoke rising from the kitchen chimneys in the streets of the capital in the middle of winter. Luoluo sat on the edge of the mountain, gazing at the clouds below, her petite figure seeming rather delicate. If one could see her face, they would probably get the same feeling, because although her picturesque face was filled with reminiscence, it was still calm. Guardianly looked at her, a look of pity in her eyes. In her view, Her Highness had been very lonely in the last few years, and was only getting lonelier. Chapter 936. Luoluo asked, "Did Imperial Mother leave the palace again today?" Guardianly whispered, "It seems like she went to the other shore for some business." Luoluo added, "Did little aunt return a few days ago?" Guardianly replied, "She should have." Luoluo asked, "Was the matter at South Stream Temple true?" Guardianly was somewhat hesitant, but she still answered yes. Luoluo was quiet for a while, then said, "Then they wanted to harm teacher." Guardianly did not dare to respond to these words, especially when she sensed the emotion in her voice. "I didn't think that the legend of New North Bridge was true. Teacher had always been acquainted with that black dragon." Luoluo gazed at the green mountain on the other shore, faintly discernible in the clouds. "But where is she being imprisoned, by Mother?" Guardianly whispered, "There's no way to find out." Luoluo sighed and said, "Am I very useless?" Guardianly didn't know how to respond. Although Her Highness was the most revered person in White Emperor City, how could she possibly influence the Empress's actions? Luoluo's spirit was suddenly roused, a happy expression appearing on her elegant face. "But it doesn't matter. Teacher once said that the most important thing in life is not whether we are useful or not, but whether we can live smoothly, whether we can live happily." In the same sea of clouds, on the edge of another cliff, there was also a petite figure, but she did not give off the impression that she was weak. Perhaps because she had never suffered since childhood and had received a different education, Mu Jiosher's beautiful face was always filled with confidence. She seemed especially bright and radiant, exuding an aura of nobility. Madame Mu could naturally tell that her younger sister was in an extremely low mood, but she was only pretending not to care. She walked to the edge of the cliff and embraced Mu Jiosher, tenderly saying, "As a daughter of the Mu clan, it truly is very difficult." Hearing these words and feeling the warmth of her sister's body, Mu Jiosher could no longer pretend. She leaned over and said in a wronged and sorrowful voice, "I also don't know when that fellow started following us. Elder sister, am I too useless?" She was naturally speaking of Qiushan Jun. Madame Mu replied, "Imperial uncle's plan was wrong from the start, so how can you be blamed?" Mu Jiosher raised her face and asked in confusion, "Wrong?" Madame Mu continued, "Even without Qiushan Jun, everyone on the plateau believed that Jusha killed Bi Tianxin. So what? Imperial uncle wanted to use the name of Cinnabar to burn this fire onto Chen Chongqing, but he did not think that the Pope of the human race was not so easy to kill." Mu Jiosher had not gone to South Stream Temple, but she was well aware of what had happened on the plateau. Her eyes widened as she asked, "But at that time, Chen Chongqing really did almost die?" Madame Mu shook her head. From the very start, Shang Xingzhou was using Imperial Uncle and had no intention of personally entering the fray. Didn't they see that the Prince of Xiang had done nothing from start to finish, quietly watching from the sidelines like a guest? Only an idiot like White Tiger would make a move before the situation is clear. Surprised, Mu Jiosher asked, "The Prince of Xiang did not act because he was intimidated by Wang Pe?" Madame Mu replied, "You've already crossed that threshold. Every action of yours has its own deep meaning. How can it be shaken by external forces?" Mu Jiosher thought, then didn't that mean that Imperial Uncle had died in vain? With hatred in her voice, she said, "The people of Zhou truly are cunning and sinister." Madame Mu replied, The matters of 1,000 autumns can never be rushed. Imperial Uncle's venerable self is only taking such a dangerous move because his lifespan is reaching its end, to see if he can obtain some good fortune. As for you and I, there's no need to be in such a rush. Once we've taken care of the matters here, we can make arrangements. Mu Jiushi thought of the grand undertaking her big sister had spoken of and couldn't help but feel somewhat agitated. I'm just worried that elder sister will be alone and without help. Madame Mu smiled. I'm not a loner like Tianhai. Mu Jiushi was still worried. But this matter is truly too grand. There's a blood feud between the demi-humans and demons. How will you convince those elders and ministers? Madame Mu replied, in the past, this matter would naturally have been difficult to handle, but now is the best time. Shang Xingzhou's ambitions are far too clear. Everyone knows that he wants to unify the world, and everyone knows that he has the ability to do so. Coupled with the fact that Qin Chongqing is such a genius and has such a great reputation, and that Emperor is also an extraordinary individual, if this master and disciple of his sect work together, let alone the demons, would your brother-in-law and those elders and ministers not be worried? Mu Jiushi replied, the venerable Taoist is naturally frightening, and Qin Chongqing isn't bad either. But that emperor resides deep in the palace, so it's truly impossible to see what's so extraordinary about him. Madame Mu replied, those who are skilled in battle have no illustrious reputation, and the ability of a shepherd only depends on the growth of his flock. Ever since that emperor began to govern, the imperial court has been clean and tidy, not sparing any worthy person. The affairs of government have been smooth, and the people have lived and worked in peace. He's even more extraordinary than his mother. Emperor Taizong was nothing more than this. Mu Jiushi pensively said, so that's how it is. She then thought of another matter and worriedly asked, then what about Bi Tianxin and Bi Yanghong? In a few days, as long as they recover from their injuries, they'll definitely come for revenge. Madame Mu replied, no, you're wrong. Mu Jiushi did not explain. Could it be that they fear Big Sister's majesty and the demi-human experts and don't dare to come? Madame Mu gazed into the depths of the sea of clouds and indifferently said, when I say that you're wrong, I'm not saying that they won't come, but that they've already come. As she spoke, a peal of thunder exploded in the sky. Boom! The sea of clouds in front of the mountain surged with countless waves that spread in all directions, but they did not split apart. In the gloomy and damp forest below the sea of clouds, countless monsters ran for their lives. Deep in the turbid waters of the Red River, some massive aquatic monsters growled and then lowered their heads. The sea of clouds in the sky was pulled toward the edge of the continent, the center growing thinner and thinner until a hole appeared. A beam of light spilled down from the hole in the clouds, accompanied by two figures. It was an extremely beautiful and mystical sight. Seeing these two figures land on a nearby green mountain to the west, Mu Jiushi's expression suddenly changed. Madame Mu was calm and silent, her thoughts inscrutable. Chapter 937. Breaking through the clouds was Bi Yanghong and Wuqiong Bai. The dust over the 80,000 li had been blown away by the strong winds in the sky, but it could not disperse the solemnity and gravity in their eyes. After leaving Holy Maiden Peak, they had taken a little time to rest, not waiting for their injuries to completely recover before rushing to White Emperor City. Even though they were experts of the divine domain, they had paid no small price. Their faces were rather pale and they seemed very tired. Standing on the green mountain, Bi Yanghong surveyed his surroundings. His eyes were slightly profound, allowing him to clearly see everything that was going on within several dozen li. On the other shore, White Emperor City was rather noisy. The demi-humans had probably sensed their arrival and were in a hurry to mobilize their armies and experts. Bi Yanghong raised his right hand and unfurled his fingers. Several deep blue ice crystals imbued with boundless cold floated out of his palm. They were blown about by the mountain winds, but they did not follow the wind. These ice crystals seemed to weigh nothing as they floated to some place behind the mountain. Byung-hong and Wucheong-bai followed behind. It didn't take long before they saw a tree more than 1,000 zhang tall rising into the sky. The top of the tree broke through the clouds, its whereabouts unknown. The tree was extremely thick, looking like a wall. There was a hole at the base of the tree, and a house had been built in the hole. A black-clothed girl sat on a stone bench in the room, her chin propped up in her hand, seeming rather worried. As if they had seen their loved ones, the blue ice crystals turned into streaks of light and flew toward the black-clothed girl. The girl sensed them and raised her head. Those deep blue ice crystals burrowed into the red birthmark between her eyebrows and vanished. The girl looked at Byung-hong and Wucheong-bai, wariness appearing on her cold and beautiful face. She was a proud and powerful dragon, but she could clearly sense that these two human experts had the ability to harm her. Byung-hong's gaze moved down to the girl's feet. As he looked at the chains, he slightly creased his brow. Wucheong-bai's complexion turned extremely nasty as she gazed at the black-clothed girl. In her view, even if Bi Tianxin's death had nothing to do with this girl, he had still died to her dragon breath. She prepared to step forward and vent her anger, but Byung-hong's stern gaze stopped her. "Lady Zhu, I will think of a way to save you," Byung-hong said to the girl. This girl was naturally the legend at the bottom of New North Bridge, the current Pope Chen Chongqing's protector. She had many names. Chen Chongqing liked to call her Gigi, but Byung-hong, an expert of the continent of his generation, still used the name Wang Jitsa had given her, Zhu. When he saw the chains at the girl's feet, Byung-hong confirmed that his son's death had nothing to do with her, as she could not leave this mountain. Since this was the case, he would naturally think to save her. Thus, he naturally had to think of a way to save her. It was truly because Byung-hong's little red flower was far too famous, and Wucheong-bai's horsetail whisk and her face were equally unsightly. This matter was also extremely famous. She had already been trapped on this cliff for some time and had vaguely guessed at something. 2 days ago, she had even sensed the death of an expert of the divine domain, but she still did not know the specifics, much less why these two experts of the continent had suddenly appeared here. She pondered Byung-hong's words and said, "Then I'll have to thank you, but it seems rather difficult." Byung-hong's gaze continued down the cliff from her ankle, his expression a little strange. The iron chain seemed to be tied to a stone hole on the ground, but with his keen eyesight, he could tell that the stone hole was actually the top of a stone embryo, and that the stone embryo was at the bottom of the cliff. In other words, the iron chain was connected to the entire mountain. If he wanted to take the little black dragon away, he would have to shatter this cliff and the extremely hard stone embryo within it, or he would have to sever the connection between the chains and the stone embryo. The former was not feasible. Although he should be able to do it if he used the full extent of his cultivation, that kind of movement would be too big. Moreover, it would consume a lot of star radiance true essence, which would greatly affect the actual battle later. As for the latter, there was clearly something wrong with the aura of the iron chain and the stone embryo, as if there was an invisible lock. Byung-hong's expression slightly froze. "Tiger roar," Gigi replied. "I don't know what it's called, but it's a pretty good name." Byung-hong knew that it was definitely correct. The object that bound the chains to the stone embryo was assuredly the legendary forbidden artifact of the demi-humans, the Tiger Roar. This was a forbidden artifact used by the White Emperor clan to punish traitors. The White Emperor clan was born with divine strength, but they were absolutely incapable of breaking free of the Tiger Roar. It was most suitable for imprisoning the little black dragon. Even an expert of Byung-hong's level would find it extremely difficult to break free of the Tiger Roar. But since it was a forbidden artifact, it assuredly had a key, and the key was naturally in Madame Mu's hands. "Once I kill her, I'll release you," Byung-hong said. Gigi replied, "Then I truly must thank you." Byung-hong suddenly sensed something and turned to look at the sea of clouds. A wind blew over from the sea of clouds, causing the sea of clouds to ripple and tremble. Many cracks appeared in the clouds. As he gazed at the meadow emerging from one of the cracks and the two women standing on the meadow, Byung-hong felt like the salty and wet air of the wind had suddenly become countless times heavier. Seeing Madame Mu's somewhat similar appearance to Mu Jiosher's, Byung-hong fell silent for a moment, then clasped his hands in greeting. Madame Mu calmly returned the greeting. Wuqiong naturally would not bow to her, nor did she speak. She only stared at Mu Jiosher, her eyes so venomous that they seemed like poisonous flames burning deep underground. No matter how extraordinary Mu Jiosher's background and proud and arrogant she was, being stared at by an expert of the divine domain like this and thinking about Bi Tianxin's matter made her feel very guilty. She instantly felt her body and mind turn cold. Somewhat afraid, she moved to hide behind Madame Mu. Byung-hong looked at Madame Mu and asked, "Empress intends to protect her?" Madame Mu replied, "This is White Emperor City, and she is my younger sister. Do you think that I would let you touch her?" Wuqiong pointed at White Emperor City across the sea of clouds and shouted, "Do you think that you can rely on those idiots of the demi-humans to stop us husband and wife?" Her voice was abnormally shrill, like two swords incessantly grinding against each other. In contrast, Byung-hong's voice was still warm and gentle, but even more resolute. "His Majesty the White Emperor is in seclusion. You are alone." Madame Mu calmly replied, "So the two of you disregarded worsening your injuries and rushed over as quickly as possible." Byung-hong replied, "Yes, I wanted to ensure that no one was faster than us." Madame Mu's expression did not change. "Do you think that as long as the great Western continent cannot send reinforcements in time, I will be forced into a situation where I have to fight one against two?" Byung-hong replied, "Correct, this is not a fair contest, but a father and mother's vengeance." Madame Mu faintly smiled. "Then did you ever think that although my husband is in seclusion, he is not cut off from the world? If I really do die, do you think that he will not act? And even if the two of you work together, are you sure that you can defeat me? Mother is in the hospital again. In the next few days, it will probably be just like it was in the last half-year. If I have time, I will write. If I don't, I will tell and report to everyone." Chapter 938. As she said this, her expression was very calm and indifferent, yet it also seemed incomparably confident and powerful. She was the princess of the great Western continent, the empress of the demi-human race. She had become a saint many years ago. Tianhai had died at the peak of the mausoleum of books, Yin had returned to the Sea of Stars, and the Holy Maiden of the South had followed Su Li to the Sacred Light continent. Of the 5 saints, only she and the White Emperor remained. There was no question that she and the White Emperor could be considered some of the strongest experts of the present age. Even if the White Emperor were in seclusion and she alone fought Byung-hong and Wuqiong, she was not certain to lose. And this was not even considering the fact that this was the shore of the Red River. There were still countless demi-human experts in White Emperor City. With a single order from her, they would surge forward like a tide. "Empress, you misunderstand," Byung-hong said. "We husband and wife have never had the extravagant hope of killing you today. We only want to take Mu Jiosher away and ask her a few questions." Mu Jiosher's small face paled at these words, not daring to respond. Madame Mu smiled. "You want to take my younger sister away and ask her a few questions about young Master B's last words, and then what?" Wuqiong finally could not restrain her emotions and harshly said, "If she cannot give an explanation, this old woman will naturally tear her to pieces." Madame Mu's smile faded as she looked at Byung-hong and asked, "Do you think I will agree?" Byung-hong replied, "You should be well aware that I have the ability to delay you for a while, enough time for my lowly wife to finish what she wants to do." Madame Mu calmly stared at him for a very long time, then suddenly laughed. Her laughter echoed between the cliffs and the sea of clouds. There was no joy in it, only toughness and indifference. I believe that Sir B has also misunderstood. Madame Mu's smile faded as she looked at him and said, I have never thought about protecting little Sher. Byung Hong's gaze froze as he asked, What does Empress mean? Everyone says that I was expelled from the great Western continent by Imperial Uncle. Over the past several centuries, countless people have felt injustice for me, like Tianhai and Elder Een. But in truth, none of them knew that I left of my own volition, and all my abilities were actually taught by Imperial Uncle. To me, Imperial Uncle was both teacher and father, the person I respected the most. Madame Mu expressionlessly said, You killed him, so I naturally had to avenge him and kill all of you. Other than that, I did not consider any other possibility. Byung Hong fell silent. With his and Wucheongbai's strength, it was very difficult for them to directly kill Madame Mu, perhaps even detain her, but the reverse was also true. Unless the other party had helpers. The question was, who would help her? With the blue-clothed visitor dead, the great Western continent scheme had been exposed. He and Wucheongbai, as the storms of the human race, had come to avenge their son. Not even Shang Xingzhou would appear in this sort of situation. Moreover, they had come so quickly that White Emperor City probably had no time to lay down any trap. The sea breeze came from outside the sky and never stopped. The 2 layers of clouds in the sky and outside the cliff kept twisting and twisting, but did not disperse. The hole in the clouds that Byung Hong and Wucheongbai had torn open was gradually covered up. The light was retracted, leaving the cliff gloomy. There was a tree on the edge of the cliff. Compared to the massive tree on the cliff where the little black dragon was imprisoned, this tree seemed particularly tiny. The tree has a shadow. In such a dim environment, the reflection of the tree should have been extremely faint, but it gradually grew thicker. The little red flower on his pinky seemed to have sensed something. It whistled through the air and pointed at the distant tree, appearing especially vigilant. Byung Hong looked at Madame Mu and said, The Empress's ambition and daring are truly frightening. Imperial Uncle insists on killing Chen Chongsheng and inciting internal strife in the Zhou dynasty, but I know that this is no easy task and that there is a high chance of failure. Madame Mu calmly said, This being the case, I will naturally prepare a few backup plans. Byung Hong sighed. He had made countless preparations and used the will of the heavens to calculate for many hours, but he had not expected that he would still fail. He said to Wucheongbai, In a little while, if I can find a chance to cut open a path, you can leave. I will follow. Wucheongbai couldn't help but be alarmed at these words, thinking, just what has happened? No matter how strong Madame Mu is, if we work together, we can still fight. Is there a need to be so pessimistic, declaring defeat before the battle has even begun? If this really was the case, why had they broken through the clouds and come to White Emperor City? Wucheongbai had a ruthless and coarse personality, but she was still an expert of the divine domain. With just a thought, she understood what had happened and turned to the tree at the edge of the cliff. The shadow cast by the tree grew thicker and thicker, gradually turning the color of ink, becoming a black cloth. The wind from the western sea rustled the leaves of the tree, rustling the shadow on the ground, like a corner of a robe being lifted. It was a real corner of a robe. This robe was black. It trembled in the wind. A person appeared beneath the tree, his entire body shrouded in a black robe. Wucheongbai's face was somewhat pale. Byung Hong's expression was abnormally solemn, unprecedentedly solemn. He knew that the two of them were facing the most dangerous situation in their lives, because they were about to face the most terrifying opponent besides the Tianhai Divine Empress. The cliff was deathly still. There was no sound, not even the sound of the wind. The black robe swayed in the wind, giving off an abnormally sinister feeling. Seeing this legendary demon military advisor, even Mu Jiosher felt a deep fear and hid far away. Byung Hong looked at Madame Mu and said, You're actually colluding with the demons. Does the White Emperor know? Do the demi-human elders know? Madame Mu calmly replied, You are the first person to see it with your own eyes. Byung-hong asked, "Have you ever thought, if this matter were to be known, how would you continue to be empress?" Madame Mu replied, "There's no need for you to worry about White Emperor City." Byung-hong asked, "Or are you saying that you're confident that no one else will know of this matter?" It was already very difficult for him and Wu Qiongbai to kill, or even defeat, Madame Mu. Similarly, it was also very difficult for her to kill the two of them. Even if Madame Mu was a saint, even if the helper she had invited today could be said to be the most mysterious and terrifying demon military advisor on the continent, it was not so easy to kill an expert of the divine domain. On the plateau of South Stream Temple, the blue-clothed visitor had died because the situation had abruptly reversed. He had gone from the person who had set the trap to the person involved, and his preparations had been severely lacking. But even in these circumstances, Byung-hong and Wang Pe had paid an extremely heavy price in order to kill this person. Madame Mu was truly powerful, and Black Robe was naturally terrifying, but Byung-hong had comprehended more after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, his cultivation level rising once more. He was confident that he could hold off his opponent for a few moments. He only needed a few moments, or the slightest gap, to send a warning to the outside world. The possibility that the demi-humans were colluding with the demons was assuredly a major event that would alarm the entire world. No matter how tense the standoff between the Great Zhou imperial court and the orthodoxy, no matter how intense their struggle, there would only be one attitude towards this matter: resolute suppression. All the experts would rush over, whether it was the heads of the noble clans, the sect master of the Mountly Sword sect, or Wang Pe. Even the venerable Taoist Shang Xingzhou might personally act. Chapter 939. Madame Mu clearly understood what Byung-hong wanted to express and said, "You have no chance." Byung-hong said no more. With a shake of his right arm, his sleeve flew through the air. Countless waves of qi rumbled like thunder as they assailed Madame Mu. It was very difficult to notice that, in contrast to his actions, a small arrow made of jade silently flew into the sky above the Red River. If this jade arrow were allowed to break through the clouds and flee in the wind, it would have to inform the human experts in the capital and the south 80,000 li away. A strand of his soul had been attached to the jade arrow, so there was no need for words. It had its own message. However, the moment the jade arrow released its radiance in the sky suddenly darkened, as if night had arrived. Black Robe waved his sleeve under the tree, transforming it into the darkness. Not only did it block the path of the jade arrow, it also obscured the surrounding secrets of the heavens. Wu Qiongbai gave a shrill howl, her horsetail whisk transforming into countless streams that enveloped the plateau. The qi of silent extinction followed, transforming into a vast lotus sea. In the depths of the lotus sea, a lotus flower sprouted, swaying in the wind and drifting in the water. It seemed slow, but it was actually moving with incredible speed toward the horizon. Madame Mu's expression was indifferent. Her two sleeves flew up, stirring up the winds in the sky. This wind came from the western sea, its dampness tinged with a chill. It was like a real blade, slicing the thick sea of clouds into countless pieces. Countless white clouds descended like a flock of sheep, descending upon the damp and barbaric forest. The qi of the world instantly became countless times more sluggish, seeming extremely viscous. Wu Qiongbai grunted as she sensed that the lotus flower formed from true essence had suddenly slowed. Although it had not been destroyed, it could no longer leave. Byung-hong's expression was as calm as ever, unaffected. The jade arrow was not Byung-hong's true move, nor was it his strongest move. He had used the jade arrow to draw Black Robe's attention, while Wu Qiongbai had used the lotus sea to draw Madame Mu's attention, and then they had attacked. A cultivator's hand could grip a sword, a pestle, or a palm, but the simplest form was to clench a fist. Byung-hong's fist punched at Black Robe. In the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, after seeing the Tianhai Divine Empress's fist, Byung-hong's most powerful technique had become his fist. There was still a distance of several thousand feet between him and Black Robe, but a dark passage suddenly appeared between them. The nameless tree on the edge of the cliff began to shake violently. A fist condensed from starlight passed through the passage at an unimaginable speed. With a power that seemed to be able to split mountains and split seas, it smashed toward Black Robe's face. Before it reached his body, Black Robe's clothes began to whistle. The Black Robe was slightly disheveled. Under the sunlight, one could faintly see the Black Robe's pale green chin, as well as two cold star-like eyes. Black Robe's eyes shone with admiration and caution as he gazed at Byung-hong's fist. Regardless of whether he was the demon military advisor or another identity, he had seen many true legendary-level powerhouses. He was also a legendary-level powerhouse. Byung-hong's fist still made him feel threatened, so he knew that he had to treat it very seriously. A gloomy, lusterless iron plate appeared in front of him. A loud bang resounded. Byung-hong's fist slammed against the iron plate. This iron plate had already been heavily injured, and now that it received the full-force blow of an expert of the divine domain, it cracked and deformed. Black Robe's body swayed twice, then he took 2 steps back. With a hum, the small tree behind him shattered into countless fragments and was then blown away by the wind, vanishing without a trace. Around 30 li behind him, on a cliff on the opposite shore of the Red River, several dozen extremely deep cracks suddenly appeared. Countless rocks rustled and tumbled down. The cliff had been split in two, and with a heavy grinding sound, it fell into the river, stirring up terrifying waves. The true power of the full-force attack of an expert of the divine domain truly could cut mountains and block rivers. Byung-hong's wariness only intensified. The continent had always had many theories about the mysterious demon military advisor Black Robe. As a human expert, he was even more so. Everyone knew that Black Robe was assuredly a legendary-level expert, but no one knew just how strong he was. Whether it was in the era of Emperor Taizong and Wang Jitsa or now, no one besides Su Li had ever exchanged blows with Black Robe. Moreover, Su Li had primarily been trying to break out of the encirclement, so it was impossible to accurately judge Black Robe's strength from the outcome of that battle. Until today, when Byung-hong punched at him. Byung-hong was not a proud person, but he was well aware of his fighting prowess amongst human experts, and he had used 90% of his strength in this punch. Yet Black Robe had so easily received it. The iron plate was probably a divine artifact, but even so, Black Robe's strength was still rather unfathomable. But it didn't matter, because even this punch was not Byung-hong's strongest move, nor was it his true move. He was keenly aware that the important point of today's battle was not whether he and his wife could defeat their opponent, but whether he could notify the human experts. Thus, whether it was the Jade Arrow, the Lotus Sea, or this punch, they were all cover-up. The moment he punched out, the string on his pinky finger had already silently snapped. The little red flower was already in the sky. Neither Black Robe nor Madame Mu could stop its departure. The little red flower flew away with unimaginable speed, drawing out a thin red line in the blue sky. A white cloud still quietly floated in the sky. If someone had been paying attention to this white cloud from the very beginning, they would realize that whether it was Byung-hong and Wuqiong by breaking through the clouds or Black Robe revealing his true body or the howling winds from the western sea, none of them had caused the white cloud to change its shape. It had not even trembled. This white cloud was extremely thick and should have been somewhat darker, but in the clear blue sky around it, it was still pure white, as if it was not real. The little red flower flew into the white cloud and then vanished. It did not fly out of the white cloud and vanish into the blue sky or into the distance. It simply vanished. Byung-hong had not noticed the white cloud at the start, but now, he suddenly sensed something and raised his head. The plateau was quiet. Neither he nor Wuqiong Bai, nor Madame Mu, nor Black Robe attacked. The white cloud slowly began to flow, and then it gradually split open. A crack appeared in the middle of the white cloud. From the ground, it looked like an eye. This I was looking down on all life on the continent. A ray of light shot out from this crack. This ray of light was golden, imbued with an unimaginable aura of light, seeming extremely divine. But this ray of light was also extremely somber, as if it could crush all things, destroy all things. Byung-hong vaguely guessed at the answer and was utterly shocked. He muttered, "Are you not afraid of the end of the world?" Chapter 940. Byung-hong's words were naturally directed at Madame Mu and Black Robe. Madame Mu stood with her hands held behind her, her expression extremely solemn and serene. She did not answer the question. The tree by the cliff had already been obliterated by the fist intent, but the shadow of the tree still remained where Black Robe stood. The mottled shadow of the tree fell on his body, obscuring his expression, but it could not drown out his voice. A strange laughter overflowed from Black Robe and then rumbled like a thunderclap into the surroundings, deafening to the ears. Byung-hong's expression gradually returned to normal, but his heart had already sunk. Today, he had come to avenge his son's death, but it now seemed that he would also die here. With a clang, he waved his sleeve. An illusory sword condensed from pure star radiance rose from the ground, cutting through the sky tens of thousands of zhang as it slashed at the white cloud. It was like a real scraping sound, like a heavy mountain sliding across the ground. The white cloud swayed for a few moments, and the little red flower within it saw its chance. It transformed into a red stream of light and returned to the plateau. It quietly floated above Byung-hong's head, seeming extremely vigilant. The white cloud scattered, the golden light filling the entire sky, dazzling and bright. If not for the seal Black Robe had laid down beforehand, this light would have alarmed the entire continent. Right now, only a few people on the two shores of the Red River could see this light. But because it was too bright, they simply could not see the true scene. Byung-hong and Wucheong-bai could see that their expressions had become abnormally grave. In Wucheong-bai's eyes, one could even see confusion and fear towards the unknown. Two figures gradually appeared in the boundless light. White wings several dozen zhang long slowly flapped behind them. These two people were completely naked, the curves of their bodies perfect and clean. There was nothing extraneous about them, and it was impossible to determine their gender. Countless rays of light exuded from their bodies and wings, seeming divine and brimming with the will to destroy. Just what were these two people? Where did they come from? The angels of the sacred light have already arrived. Do you still want to resist? Black Robe's voice was abnormally cold, but compared to the last 1,000 years, it was tinged with an indescribable emotion. It seemed like the appearance of these two existences, he called angels of the sacred light, had also somewhat affected his mind. Byung-hong was truly flabbergasted that the legend had become reality and appeared before his eyes. However, he was one of the strongest experts on this continent after all, so he quickly regained his composure. Especially when his gaze pierced through the light and swept across the bodies of the two angels, his expression became indifferent. With just these two androgynous monsters? He did not know if those two so-called angels in the sky had understood his word. The battle began in the next moment. Two streams of light ignored the distance of several thousand zhang between the blue sky and the plateau, seemingly passing through space to arrive in front of Byung-hong and Wucheong-bai. What followed was infinite light, a terrifying pressure, and a sacred yet destructive attack. In the dazzling light, for the first time, Byung-hong and Wucheong-bai clearly saw the faces of these two angels up close, though only for an instant. The appearances of those two angels were extremely perfect. Their expressions were absolutely indifferent, devoid of any human emotions. They were filled with a sense of holiness. There was an arc-shaped light scar between their eyebrows. It was extremely beautiful and incomparably holy. From the perspective of a human, these two angels looked very similar, only their qi distinguishing them. One was extremely callous, the other ruthless, but they were also not human emotions. They were more like inanimate objects, like furious waves or frigid frost. A sword glow tore through the waves of light and slashed at the callous angel, but it was caught between the two wings. Byung-hong sensed a power as majestic as the starry sky. The illusory sword condensed from star radiance was instantly shattered into countless fragments. The little red flower shrieked, its petals blooming, blocking the fragments and the waves of light. A loud bang resounded. Countless cracks appeared on the plateau, stones madly flying, and a hole several zhang deep appeared. Byung-hong stood at the bottom of the hole, his hands raised. The angel indifferently floated in the air, one of its hands pressing down. The situation on the other side was even more perilous. As she watched the angel descend from the sky, Wuqiongbai recalled the legend she had read as a child in the 10,000 Years Pavilion. Her heart trembled in fear and unease, her Tao heart finding it hard to guard. The lotus sea swayed in the absence of wind, a gap appearing in her defenses. The angel transformed into a stream of light and slashed down like a sword. With a light swish, Wuqiongba's left arm was cut off, flying into the sky in a dazzling spray of golden blood. Hearing his wife's scream, Byung-hong bellowed and punched out with both fists, imbued with the star radiance and true essence he had bitterly cultivated for centuries. He pushed back the angel and rushed to Wuqiongbai. With a wave of his right hand, he once more condensed a sword of star radiance and forced back the angel. The little red flower flew back, rapidly circling around Byung-hong and Wuqiongbai like a shooting star, exuding a powerful qi that temporarily stabilized the situation. In a single exchange, Byung-hong knew that these two angels from the sacred light continent were extremely terrifying. These two angels seemed to instinctively understand and freely use the laws of the world. If placed in the cultivation system of this continent, they would be innately experts of the divine domain. Moreover, their bodies seemed to be formed from the purest sacred light energy, incomparably tough and indestructible. Even the demon imperial clan would find it very difficult to compare to them. Most frightening of all was their unimaginable speed and reflexes. They were like real rays of light, able to defy the laws and principles of the world to advance and retreat. In the face of such powerful and inexperienced opponents, even Byung-hong, who was ranked near the top of the divine domain, found it extremely difficult to deal with them. As for Wuqiongbai, she could not even take a single blow. If not for Byung-hong's godly reaction speed, she would have already lost her life. Wuqiongbai knew that the situation was extremely dangerous, so even though her severed arm was in extreme pain and the divine energy within was still wreaking havoc, preventing her from using star radiance to repair her body, she clenched her teeth and made no sound. Her face was as pale as snow and the fear in her eyes could not be dispelled. Byung-hong gazed at his wife's wretched state, his eyes chilling with rage. The two angels floated in the air, expressionlessly watching Wuqiongbai and Byung-hong on the plateau. The callous angel's gaze fell on Wuqiongba's severed arm, looked at the golden blood dripping from it, and suddenly opened his mouth to speak. As he spoke, his expression was indifferent, but his voice was dignified to the extreme. He was probably using the language of the sacred light continent, his tone extremely strange and complex. Logically speaking, no one on the plateau should have been able to understand his words. But strangely, his words, blown by the chilly winds of the mountains, became the language of the continent. As expected of thieves of fire, you have profaned God and must die. Chapter 941. Byung-hong understood these words, but he did not quite understand their meaning. He did not know what fire-stealers were or what god these foreign experts worship. He knew that he was facing the most dangerous situation of his life, even more dangerous than when he faced the Tianhai Divine Empress in the Mausoleum of Book. That his foe could make the chilly winds of the mountains transform his voice into the language of the continent proved that his conjecture was correct. These monsters from the sacred light continent truly did have an innate ability to understand and use the laws of the world. It was even possible that their existence was based on these laws. But Byung-hong was now extremely calm, even his expression indifferent. As an expert of the continent, when encountering a truly major event, he naturally could not panic, needed to maintain his composure. After the previous clash, he had a grasp of the way these two angels fought and the way they used the laws of the world. In a one-on-one battle, he was confident that he would not lose. The problem was that his wife had lost an arm and was heavily injured, while Madame Mu and Black Robe, two truly unfathomable experts, were still at the side. The ruthless angel suddenly descended, the sword of light in his hand slashing at Bi-Yang Hong. Although he had only been awake for a short period of time, his will to fight was still intact. He sensed that this human expert could threaten him. Thus, he decided to first eliminate this person. Bi-Yang Hong swung his sleeve and attacked with extreme elegance, the hand gripping the illusory sword of star radiance noiselessly bursting out of his sleeve. A fist appeared in the air and smashed the angel's sword of light into pieces. At the same time, the rapidly spinning red flower suddenly left Bi-Yang Hong's side and attacked the face of the other angel. The little red flower suddenly shattered into countless extremely sharp petals. With a dense howl, light exploded. Then it suddenly faded. When it once more illuminated the surroundings, it was already 10-some li away in the sky. Several tiny wounds appeared on the faces of the two angels, golden blood brimming with divine energy dripping down like dew. They looked at Bi-Yang Hong hovering in the air, but their eyes were still devoid of emotion, anger, wariness, only indifference. The more it was like this, the more terrifying it was. Countless peals of thunder exploded in the sky, waves of qi gushing out and cruelly tearing the last white cloud to shreds. After a while, countless streams of light fell from the sky and finally turned into visible lines of fire. It looked like a meteor shower. The people of White Emperor City cried out in alarm and chaos ensued. Some of the more cowardly people even thought that it was heavenly punishment and knelt on the ground, kowtowing. Some of the large tribes and the manners of the wealthy immediately activated their arrays, preparing to withstand the infinitely high temperature of the lava. The beast guards of the palace, the army of White Emperor City, and the large number of experts under the control of the Council of Elders were already prepared to quickly extinguish the flames. But the situation was not as frightening as imagined. Those streams of fire vanished before they could reach the ground, leaving only the remnants of heavenly fire that caused the temperature of White Emperor City to soar. It was like a blistering summer day had arrived, and only a few streams of light fell into the Red River. All of the sky above White Emperor City had been sealed off by restrictive spells, so that no sound or light could escape. The experts of the continent who could understand those streams of light could not see them, and the demi-human populace and ministers who could see those streams of light did not know what they were. Blood fell from the sky. Each streak of light was a drop of blood. This blood came from the experts of the distant continent, and it also came from the experts of this continent. They were all supreme existences of the divine domain, and their blood contained boundless divine energy. It was as pure and holy as gold, and even hotter than magma. When a few drops of divine blood fell into the Red River, those huge monsters silently sank deeper into the water. Many of the less intelligent monsters could not resist their instinctive desires at all. They swam over with all their might, and then fought fiercely over the blood, fighting over it to devour it. The monsters that devoured the last few drops of divine blood were immediately devoured by even more savage monsters. This process was cruel and boring, repeated many times. Only late in the night did the ownership of these drops of divine blood finally be determined, seized by a fire flood dragon that had come from the depths of the celestial tree. This fire flood dragon was not one of the lucky ones. With a fighting strength comparable to a star condensation expert, it was simply incapable of enduring the divine energy contained in these drops of divine blood. In the turbulent and treacherous waters, the fire flood dragon struggled for an entire night, ultimately combusting and dying. On that night, the Red River was so bright that it seemed to be burning. On that night, Many demi-human commoners noticed the strangeness of the Red River. They kneeled on the banks and prayed, praying for the White Emperor to come out of seclusion as soon as possible, praying for God to bestow His grace, praying for the 9 celestial trees hidden in the clouds to block all calamities for the demi-human race. Although those streaks of light did not land on the ground and did not bring with them the terrifying heavenly fire, White Emperor City was still in chaos. The waves of chi from the sky had damaged many buildings, and the fences of the beast gardens and pastures near the celestial tree had been completely overturned. Countless beasts had taken advantage of the chaos to escape. In order to maintain order and stabilize the situation as quickly as possible, White Emperor City was officially under martial law. Other than the commoners kneeling on the banks of the river, the majority of the city was quiet and soldiers patrolled the street. Places near the Imperial Palace and forbidden areas like White Stone Mountain were even personally guarded by the elite Red River Beast Guard. The outer city along the river was somewhat more relaxed, and it was much more deserted than usual. No one dared to go out, and even if they did, they would kneel to the blazing Red River. No one was in the mood to get drunk. The small tavern's business was extremely poor and it had long since closed. Xian Yuanpa left the small tavern and went to the shore. As he gazed at the light and flames rising from the depths of the river, he sensed the divine qi contained within. He subconsciously glanced up at the sky, thinking, just what happened during the day. Was it a battle between experts of the divine domain? From Star Caesar Academy to the Orthodox Academy, from the capital to White Emperor City, the Bear Youth had always been extremely diligent in his cultivation. In the eyes of others, his arm had long since been crippled, but he still maintained an extremely strong self-confidence, just like those other fellows in the Orthodox Academy. However, he was keenly aware that with his current cultivation level, he was still extremely far from the divine domain. No matter how long he looked, he would not be able to discover anything from those divine flames in the river. As a result, he quickly left the riverbank and walked back to his home. His home was also in the outer city along the river in a place called the Pine Paths. Many of the poor people of White Emperor City lived here, and the majority of the buildings were constructed from the most common and cheapest pine wood, barely enough to keep out the cold. However, the flow of water was often not smooth, and as he walked through it, he would occasionally smell a foul stench. Xian Yuanpa seemed unaware of this as he silently walked along the slope. Whether it was the cursing coming from the houses on the side of the street, the galloping of heavy cavalry in the distance, or those flying carriages flying through the night sky that looked extremely like streaks of fire, none of them caused his expression to change. Chapter 942. He turned right at a small alley called 3 Harmonies Li, walked to the end of the alley, and pushed open a rather old-fashioned wooden door. This was the small courtyard that he had lived in for several years. This courtyard was very small, only a zhang or so in circumference, but it was extremely clean. The ground was paved with white stones, and a pine tree not even taller than a man was planted among the white stones. It was especially beautiful against the gray walls and black eaves. The small courtyard was surrounded by the temple of the celestial tree of the Pine Paths. It was very quiet, and besides the 2 tolls of the bell, there was no other noise. It could be said that this small courtyard was the best building in the Pine Paths, though not many people knew of it. Xian Yuanpa walked over the white stones and sat down on the wooden floor in front of the door. He took off his shoes and put on a pair of clean white socks. Before entering, he glanced at the pile of firewood by the door. The pile of firewood was not very high, but it was very neat. If one looked carefully, they would even realize that the length and thickness of each firewood were almost exactly the same. Xian Yuanpa thought for a while, then he slowly pulled out a metal rod from the pile. This metal rod had no edges, much less any edge. It looked very ordinary and unremarkable. In truth, it was a sword. No matter how the tier of legendary weapons was ranked, this sword would assuredly be ranked in the top 10. Who could have imagined that the legendary mountain sea sword was currently in a small courtyard in the slums of White Emperor City, and that its owner had casually stuck it in a pile of firewood? It had received a similar treatment in the Orthodox Academy, even having to endure the smoke of the kitchen and even be responsible for prodding the charcoal fire in the stove. Xian Yuan hefted the metal sword and pushed open the door. The area of the room was also very small, with a low table and several prayer mats. In the middle was a paper door, separating the living quarters. Xian Yuan gazed at the paper door, his left hand gripping the metal sword slightly tightening. His breathing remained calm, but his expression became extremely solemn. The paper door was very thin. Let alone the mountain sea sword, even his stalwart and muscular body would be blown over by a single breath. Just what was he on guard against? Or even a faint fear? Suddenly, a voice came from the paper door. I don't know who you are, but since you were able to sense our presence the moment you entered the small courtyard, you must also be a cultivator. Please come in and have a chat. Xian Yuan showed no surprise. He looked at the paper door and asked, Who are you? On the other side of the paper door, the room was slightly dark. Occasionally, the light from the flying chariot would pass through the tall window and illuminate the room for a moment. There was some blood on the wall, and there was a faint golden color in it, but there were no longer any aura fluctuations. A Taoist nun was leaning against the wall. Her appearance was delicate and pretty, and it was impossible to tell her age. Her brows were filled with hostility, but her eyes were filled with fear. A scholar sat beside her. His face was slightly pale, but his expression was calm as usual. It was Bi Yanghong and Wu Qiongbai. If not for the fact that Madame Mu was maintaining the seal over White Emperor City and Black Robe was shielding them from the heavens, they would have found it very difficult to escape alive. Even so, they had still suffered severe injuries at the hands of those two angels, paying an enormous price. Wu Qiongbai was alarmed and infuriated by Bi Yanghong's words. Why didn't you quickly kill him and let him in? Since you are the owner of this place, how can you be rejected by the guests? Bi Yanghong looked at the figure on the paper door and calmly said, We cannot move, cannot come out to welcome you. Please enter. Xian Yuan fell quiet for a while, then raised his sword and pushed open the paper door. The first thing he saw was a pile of crystals on the ground, 2 small pagodas, and several pieces of spirit wood. It was obvious that this was some sort of array that could ensure that none of the qi within the array leaked out and could not be discovered. Then he raised his head to look at the 2 people leaning against the wall. It was not that the brats of the Orthodox Academy had naturally become more careful as they grew older, but because so many things had happened in White Emperor City today. The Red River Beast Guard was still searching everywhere and the flying carriage was still flying through the night sky, so he had no choice but to be more cautious. Xian Yuan stared blankly at the pale and wary Taoist nun. When he saw the severed arm on her shoulder and the blood covering her body, he couldn't help but be dazed. Is this the cycle of the heavenly Tao? On a certain night, this Taoist nun came to the capital and tortured a stray dog to death. Guanbai stopped her, so she cut off one of Guanbai's arms. Soon after, this Taoist nun came to the Orthodox Academy, broke through the wall, and wanted to kill him just to vent her emotions. If not for Su Li's letter, he would have died that night and the Orthodox Academy would have been destroyed. In his eyes at the time, this Taoist nun was a true demon, powerful and callous. Who could have expected that when they met again after so many years, this Taoist nun would be heavily injured? Her arm severed, Xian Yuan said nothing, only turned to the man dressed in scholar's robes. There were no wounds on this person's body, not even dust, and his expression was very calm. But Xian Yuan sensed an aura of death. It was obvious that this person had suffered even more serious injuries, in an even deeper part of his body. When he thought of this, Xian Yuan suddenly felt sorrowful. Since the Taoist nun was Wu Qiongbai, this person was naturally Bi Yanghong. Just who in the world could injure Bi-Yang and Wuqiongbai like this? When they were chatting in the Orthodox Academy, Tang 36 had once discussed this question with them. Only that saint couple could defeat this divine domain couple, the White Emperor and the Empress. The problem was that the White Emperor was in seclusion, so who was the Empress's helper? As Xianyuan Po thought of these things, Bi-Yang gaze fell on the metal sword in his hand. The mountain sea sword had slumbered in the garden of Zhou's sword pool for many years and then remained in the Orthodox Academy, never appearing. Not even he had seen its true body. But he could sense that the energy contained within this sword was extremely extraordinary. Then what of the person who possessed this sword? This person was assuredly a demi-human expert. Bi-Yang mentally sighed, thinking, this is fate. There's nothing to be done. But Xianyuan Po did nothing. He did nothing, nor did he send any warnings. After a moment of silence, he asked, "What sort of medicine do you need?" Bi-Yang froze at these words. Wuqiongbai hatefully said, "What do you want to do? Don't even think about harming us." It was obvious that she had already recognized Xianyuan Po. When she and Bi-Yang had left the plateau, they were already heavily injured. Let alone fighting, they couldn't even stand. The seal on the two shores of the Red River had been activated, and it was impossible to conceal their track. They had risked entering White Emperor City to take advantage of the chaos to find a chance of survival. At the time, White Emperor City was truly in chaos, but soon after, many demi-human experts began to appear, clearly in pursuit of them. They hid in all directions, eventually arriving at the less guarded outer city along the river. Walking into the pine paths, they sensed a spiritual intent in one of the alleys. Following it, they found a small courtyard and snuck into it. But before they could discover where the spiritual intent was, their injuries erupted and they hurriedly laid down an array. Xianyuan Po returned. Chapter 943. Wuqiongbai had never imagined that she would meet this person in White Emperor City. Although Xianyuan Po had left the capital for several years, she believed that this person would never forget the grudge from back then, just like her. Thus, his words and his seemingly innocent actions assuredly hid an extremely sinister motive, just like her usual conduct. Xianyuan Po said nothing. Wuqiongbai spoke these words with a deep hatred. She seemed to be clenching her teeth, but her eyes were filled with fear. It was clear that she was very afraid that Xianyuan Po would kill her or notify the demi-human experts of White Emperor City. Xianyuan Po felt no joy at this sight. He only felt some loathing and pity. He said to Bi-Yang, "The Deer Tribe's medicine storehouse is not far away. I know the steward, so I should be able to get some medicine." Bi-Yang replied, "If that's the case, then I'll have to trouble little brother." Wuqiongbai harshly retorted, "I don't believe you." Xianyuan Po ignored her, taking the medicine list Bi-Yang had written and leaving the room. Wuqiongbai's expression flickered at the sound of the door closing. Nervously and angrily, she yelled at Bi-Yang, "This bear cub has an old grudge with me. If you let him leave, he will assuredly notify the demi-human court. You don't even know him, so why would you rather believe him than me?" Bi-Yang calmly replied, "Although I don't know this person, I know that he is a student of the Orthodox Academy." Wuqiongbai froze at these words, but she said nothing more. Her right hand hanging by her side trembled, indicating that she was not in a calm state of mind. After some time, Xianyuan Po returned to the small courtyard in 3 harmonies Li. In his hand was a heavy bag that seemed to be packed with many things. Bi-Yang sincerely expressed his thanks. Xianyuan Po shook his head, opened the bag, and took out the medicine. Suddenly, there was the sound of rushing wind in the quiet room. A horsetail whisk trailed behind it as it attacked Xianyuan Po's face. Xianyuan Po had not expected it and was too late to respond. Fortunately, the mountain sea sword promptly flew through the air and crossed over his head, blocking the horsetail whisk. With a clap, the small courtyard swayed and the dust in the cracks in the floorboards was jolted into the air. If it weren't for the spiritual wood true tower formation on the ground, the commotion would have been even greater. Xian Yuanpe knelt on the ground on one knee, holding the iron sword horizontally in front of him. He felt as if a mountain was pressing down on him. It was extremely strenuous, and his breathing became much heavier. He raised his head to look at Wuqiangbai's eyes that seemed to want to devour him. Furious and confused, he yelled, "Have you gone mad?" Wuqiangbai harshly retorted, "Back then, I wanted to kill you, and tonight, I even less want to accept your favor, or else it would be a humiliation. So you must die, and only a dead person will not reveal the secret." He had grown up in the mountains of a remote tribe, and when he went to the capital, he studied and lived in the simplest of places like Star Caesar Academy and the Orthodox Academy. Xian Yuanpe simply couldn't understand Wuqiangbai's logic and angrily said, "Woman, how could you be so vicious? Malicious or crazy?" Wuqiangbai was still an expert of the divine domain. Even though she had lost an arm and was heavily injured, she was still countless times stronger than Xian Yuanpe. The iron sword gradually sank, and Xian Yuanpe looked as if he would not be able to hold on any longer. All of a sudden, a tinge of color appeared in the quiet room. This tinge was bright red, moist, and incomparably fresh. It was that little red flower. Wuqiangbai's face was filled with shock and fear as she stared at the little red flower. She quickly drew back her horsetail whisk and placed it in front of her. With a few light pops, Bi-Yang-Hong's finger descended like the wind, sealing off 2 of Wuqiangbai's meridians. Wuqiangbai was furious. She mobilized her true essence to forcefully break through the seal and counterattack. Bi-Yang-Hong drew back his finger and watched the approaching horsetail whisk. He did not move. Wuqiangbai's expression froze, her movements a little sluggish. Bi-Yang-Hong vomited a mouthful of true blood, his face instantly paling. The little red flower flew back to his side and quietly floated there. Drops of dew began to appear on its heavily damaged petals, as if it was weeping. After leaving the plateau, the bit of true essence that Bi-Yang-Hong had gathered after several hours had completely dissipated with this mouthful of true blood. Wuqiangbai saw this and finally understood. With a cry, she threw herself at him, embraced him, and began to weep. "You're crazy! Just for a bear cub like this." Xian Yuanpe had a very perplexed expression. He did not understand what was going on. He had clearly wanted to save Bi-Yang-Hong out of goodwill, so why did Wuqiangbai want to kill him, and why did Bi-Yang-Hong want to protect him? Why did Wuqiangbai want Bi-Yang-Hong dead in her rage, and why did she want nothing more than to die in his place when she saw Bi-Yang-Hong vomit blood, and in such pain? Were this couple of experts of the continent crazy? Xian Yuanpe fell quiet for a while, then said, "There are many people that want to capture the 2 of you. In the next 2 days, a major event will occur in White Emperor City, and many more experts will arrive. The 2 of you should stay here and not go out. I have some matters to take care of in the next 2 days. When the time comes, we'll see how to deal with them." After saying this, he put away the mountain sea sword, placed the medicine and the food and water he had bought on the ground, and got up to leave. When he reached the paper door, he stopped and suddenly asked, "Teacher, how could a person like you marry a woman like this?" Bi-Yang-Hong did not answer this question. The wooden door to the courtyard closed once more and silence returned. The only sound was the soft rustling of the short pine tree in the night wind. The room was quiet for a very long time, until the mood became increasingly oppressive and awkward. Wuqiangbai looked at Bi-Yang-Hong and said in a trembling voice, "Senior brother, have you always regretted marrying me all these years?" Bi-Yang-Hong faintly smiled at her. "Just what nonsense are you thinking? I presume that this is not the first time you've heard what that bear cub said." The more Wuqiangbai thought about it, the more embarrassed and angry she became. "Do you think I don't know?" In front of the Mausoleum of Books, on Holy Maiden Peak, whether it was that demon empress of Tianhai or Wang Po, wasn't this the same look in their eyes when they looked at me? The entire world thinks that I'm not worthy of you. Bi-Yang-Hong sighed. Why do we need to care about what other people think of the matter between us? Wu Qiongbai yelled, "Aren't you the same? You think that I often embarrass you in front of the world." Biang Hong calmly gazed at her and said, "Junior sister, I've never regretted marrying you, only regretted spoiling you too much." When he said this, his expression was very sincere. Wu Qiongbai froze. It was hard to say if she really understood the meaning of these words. She only knew that she wanted to say something, but she realized that she didn't know what to say. She felt deeply wronged and began to weep bitterly, thinking, "Why was my luck so bad that I just had to meet this person?" Chapter 944. The demi-human experts and the elite Red River Beast Guard had received the Empress's decree and were searching for the whereabouts of Biang Hong and his wife. Coupled with the phenomena from yesterday, the atmosphere in White Emperor City was abnormally tense. All the gates of the surrounding small cities leading to the mountains and wilderness had already been closed. It was difficult for the clouds and mists in the mountains to disperse. Only when the sun was at its brightest or when the mountain winds were at their strongest could one clearly see the 9 massive trees that reached into the clouds. But now even more gazes were cast in the direction of the mountains. On the other side of the mountains was the Western Sea, and in the depths of the Western Sea was the rumored Great Western Continent. The latest rumor was that the second prince of the Great Western Continent was coming to White Emperor City to marry Princess Luoheng. Today the rumor was confirmed. The gates of the small cities leading to the mountains were all opened, the official roads trembled, and the monsters took shelter. The Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission was about to arrive at White Emperor City, and its representative was the second prince. The diplomatic mission was using the excuse of celebrating the White Emperor's birthday. Coupled with the relationship between the Great Western Continent and the Empress, the demi-humans had no reason to refuse. When the diplomatic mission finally entered White Emperor City, the tense atmosphere that had persisted for an entire day and night slightly relaxed. Many people from the demi-human tribes surged onto the streets to watch the spectacle. Similarly, watching the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission, but with incomparable wariness, naturally came from the humans. White Emperor City had 3 important buildings of the human race. They were the Great Zhou Imperial Court's diplomatic mission, the Orthodoxy's Taoist Church of the Western Wastes, and the Tang clan's trading company that represented the powers of the South. The first reaction of the Imperial Court's envoy and the Tang clan's steward upon learning of this matter was that if White Emperor City really did want to form a marriage alliance with the Great Western Continent, they had assuredly made all the necessary preparations. Other than informing the Imperial Court and Wen Shui of this news as quickly as possible, there was nothing else they could do. The bishops of the Taoist Church of the Western Wastes, which represented the will of the Orthodoxy, also understood that this matter was difficult to disrupt, but now that the entire continent knew that the Great Western Continent's imperial clan intended to harm the Pope, they had sent people to gather the Pope's students. How could they tolerate this? At the same time that the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission entered the palace, the Orthodoxy's Taoist Church of the Western Wastes also sent an extremely unyielding letter of protest that was comparable to a letter of challenge. At the same time, the invitation to a banquet for the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission was torn to shreds by the Archbishop of the Taoist Church of the Western Wastes in front of several thousand demi-human believers and then stomped on the shreds, leaving no face for the demi-humans. After confirming this news, the Great Zhou Embassy and the Tang family firm also declined the invitation to the banquet, but in comparison, they behaved more gently. Regardless of the attitude of the human race, the banquet was held as usual. That night, White Emperor City was decorated with lanterns and streamers, especially the imperial palace at the highest point. It could be said that it was brightly lit, and the place was bustling with activity. Even after the banquet ended, the liveliness did not subside. This was because the main guests, the members of the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission, had gone to rest, but many of the guests had not left. The hundreds of Red River beast guards responsible for the safety of the palace were very vigilant and even somewhat nervous as they looked at the figures that remained in the palace. However, they did not dare to chase them away, and they did not even dare to persuade them. This was because these guests were all important figures of the Yao race, and some were even their fathers. Some of the important figures of the demi-human race in the palace were generals, ministers, and the majority were members of the Council of Elders. The Council of Elders of the demi-human race was somewhat similar to the Council of Elders of the demon race, but it was stronger and had a higher status. The demi-human race was composed of more than 300 tribes, and the 27 tribes with the longest histories and the strongest factions were naturally members of the Council of Elders. There were also 10 seats that were elected by the remaining tribes. As for the ranking of the Council of Elders, it was very simple. Whoever had lived the longest and was stronger would be ranked first. At present, the chief elder of the demi-human race was the leader of the Xiong clan. It was rumored that this chief elder possessed divine strength. Although he had not yet stepped into the divine, he already had the ability to fight against experts of the divine domain. The chief elder's mountainous body was striking in front of the palace, but he was also as silent as a mountain. His silence did not quell the chatter in the palace. On the contrary, it seemed to become a sort of connivance. The chatter grew louder and louder, the mood growing more and more tense. These discussions were naturally related to the Great Western Continent's diplomatic mission, to yesterday's phenomena, and also to the rumors of the last few days. Was Princess Luoluo really going to be married? Was there a need to be so anxious? Had His Majesty still not recovered from his injuries? The question was, why couldn't it be Princess Luoluo? Although such a thing had truly never happened in the history of the demi-human race, wasn't it said that the Pope had already resolved her problem? A single rumor would give rise to many other speculations. Both the members of the Council of Elders and the demi-human generals were speculating on the veracity of the rumor and many other problems. Of course, whether Princess Luoluo was married or who she was married to had little to do with them, because the Emperor of the demi-human race would always be a member of the White Emperor clan. The only ones who had the right were a few side branches of the White Emperor clan, but for fear of angering His Majesty and the Empress, they were even more subdued and silent, not daring to express any opinion. But did she have to be married to the second prince of the Great Western Continent? Madame Mu slowly walked into the palace hall, which seemed rather spacious because of its size. The demi-human elders, generals, and ministers all bowed in unison. The voice of the great elder of the demon race, who was as tall as a mountain, was incomparably deep and resounding, like an echo from deep within the mountains. But the words he spoke were extremely direct, incomparably in keeping with the demi-human race's personality and habit of discussing matters. Empress, do you truly intend to marry Her Highness off to the nephew of your paternal clan? The chief elder looked at Madame Mu, his right hand gripping the hilt of his axe, making no attempt to conceal his actions. If we do that, we will rebel. Madame Mu looked extremely petite in front of him, like a little person, but her aura was even more powerful. She indifferently said to the chief elder, "Then all of you can rebel." It was an incomparably indifferent sentence, but it was the most overbearing declaration. She had already been empress for several centuries and was deeply in love with the White Emperor. She was no longer that young girl who had just entered the land of the demi-humans. Her prestige in the demi-human race was extremely high. Whether it was the tribal leaders or the young hunters on the two shores of the Red River, they all regarded her as a god, not daring to show the slightest disrespect. At these words, the palace hall fell silent. No one dared to speak, only the night breeze lightly brushing against the sturdy stone walls. Even the chief elder felt a powerful pressure. After a moment of silence he said, "We need an explanation." Madame Mu expressionlessly said, "Rumors are just rumors. Moreover, even if she is to be married, why is Elder rebelling?" The chief elder's expression did not change as he indifferently said, Empress, Empress, you should know the reason. Chapter 945. Madame Mu's gaze swept over the mountainous bodies of the demi-human generals. I understand what all of you are thinking. Luoheng is my own daughter. If she could inherit the throne, would His Majesty and I still be so worried? In the end, rumors are just rumors. Whether from a few days ago or a few years ago, no matter how brimming with talent His Holiness the Pope is, he was still just a teenager. Do all of you really think that he can resolve a problem that has eluded my race for tens of thousands of years? It's just a trick that the human race has played. These words were extremely reasonable and persuasive. The elders, generals, and ministers in the hall thought about how Princess Luoluo was still as petite and weak as she was when she was a child, not even having completed the fourth transformation of the divine body. She truly was completely different from His Majesty. Presumably, the problem of her meridians truly had not been resolved, and they couldn't help but sigh in regret. The chief elder was not convinced. I want to see His Majesty. Madame Mu stared into his eyes and said, You know that His Majesty is currently recuperating. The chief elder replied, I know, but the succession of the demi-human race is an important matter. His Majesty should be able to understand my intrusion. Madame Mu fell quiet for a while, then said, If His Majesty is willing to see you, he naturally can. 2 hours later, the chief elder returned to the palace hall. The flames of the oil candles stuck in the stone walls flickered despite the lack of wind. Countless pairs of eyes fell on the great elder, wanting to know if he had seen His Majesty by day and what His Majesty had said. The chief elder shook his head and said, I did not see His Majesty. The demi-human elders, ministers, and generals in the hall sighed in regret. But I sensed His Majesty's will, so I will no longer oppose this matter. The chief elder turned to Madame Mu and said, But this matter must be carried out according to the tens of thousands of years of tradition of my demi-human race. Even if Her Highness wishes to marry, it cannot be arranged in private. The wildfire of the celestial tree must choose its master, obeying the will of the ancestral spirits and gods. These words once more caused the hall to buzz with discussion, but this had always been a part of the rumor, so it was not too shocking. Madame Mu asked, Your meaning is to formally hold the heavenly selection ceremony? Correct. The chief elder's hand once more rested on his axe. Otherwise, we will still rebel. Madame Mu stared into his eyes and said, Everything will be done according to the rules of the clan. There can be no mistake. Do you dare to agree? The great elder said, Your Highness, you are deeply respected by the people of the clan. It has been several hundred years since then, and I am old. I only hope that everything will be the same as before. After saying this, he walked out of the hall, his mountain-like body casting a large shadow on the floor. The majority of the demi-human elders, and about half of the ministers and generals bowed to Madame Mu and followed the chief elder out. Madame Mu was quiet for a while, then she waved her sleeve, indicating that the ministers loyal to her in the hall should leave. Silence returned to the main hall. There was no one else besides her. The flame of the oil candle gave off a bright light, but there was a faint burnt smell. Moreover, when the night wind blew, the light became uneven. Several centuries had passed, but she still had not gotten used to it. She still somewhat missed the gentle light emitted by the merfolk pearls in the great western continent's imperial palace. The stone wall was illuminated very clearly. It looked extremely smooth, but under her gaze, she could naturally see the undulations on it. How could such coarse stone be qualified to enter the imperial palace? When she was a princess of the great western continent, she would never have imagined such a thing. Yes, she had been in White Emperor City for many years, but there were still many things that she could not get used to. Like the things mentioned earlier, like what had just happened. In the great western continent or the capital of the human race, a person with the chief elder's attitude would have been executed long ago. But this was White Emperor City. For tens of thousands of years, the demi-humans living here had lived like this. Discussions were direct, or perhaps barbaric. They were truly a pack of uncivilized beasts. She could not get used to it, nor could she truly change all this, because she was only the Empress, not the White Emperor. She stood in the center of the empty palace hall in silence for a very long time. A wind blew in from the distant western sea, howling into the mountains. Many of the fish in the blue lake behind the mountains had died. A faint smile appeared on her face, incomparably affectionate, like a mother looking at her child. She had always been the mother of all demi-humans. With a flicker of light, a young man walked in. This young man was very handsome, tall, and elegant. He was the second prince of the great western continent. Madame Mu tenderly said, "You've made this trip for nothing. It's truly been hard on you." The second prince smiled. "Four cousins' happiness, what does a little rain and wind count for? Besides, it's been many years since I've seen the scenery of the two shores of the Red River. I rather miss it." Madame Mu added, "Once the heavenly selection begins, entering the celestial tree to comprehend the wildfire will also be of great help to your cultivation. It's rare for me to come, so I naturally have to seek some benefits. But just who is the excellent husband that lady has chosen for cousin?" The second prince curiously asked. "Lady is so sure that he will be chosen by the ancestral spirits?" Madame Mu replied, "I only care about having him enter the celestial tree to be baptized by the wildfire. As for whether he will be chosen by the ancestral spirits, that will depend on his own ability." The second prince thought this over, then asked, "Is it Xiaoda?" Madame Mu patted his arm. "Don't think too much. Spend some more time chatting with your aunt. She's not in a good mood lately." The second prince sneered. "If I didn't know that Chen Chongqing wouldn't come, I would definitely have exchanged blows with him." The day the great Western continent's diplomatic mission arrived at White Emperor City. It was also the day after Bi Yanghong and Wuqiong Bai had arrived at White Emperor City. It was also the day after the internal strife of South Stream Temple. It was also the day before the heavenly selection ceremony began. At that time, Chen Chongqing was still at Mount Li and had not yet received the letter from Hongyan from the capital, nor had he received the letter personally written by his master, Shang Xingzhou, from the Prince of Luoyang. Neither the imperial court nor the orthodoxy had received any news from White Emperor City. Shang Xingzhou, who understood the secrets of the heavens, also had his gaze temporarily paused on Xuelao City in the north. No one knew that many days ago, a person had departed from Xuelao City and then entered White Emperor City on the same day as the great Western continent's diplomatic mission. This young man had smoothly passed the inspection of the beast guards and taken up residence in a courtyard in the eastern part of the city. This courtyard had existed for many years. It was very ordinary, but it was very wide. The ground was covered in yellow sand, making it seem like a desert. A few bloodstains, suffused with a luster, seemed to have been mixed in with bits of gold, but they had long since lost their scent. Deep within the yellow sand was a tree. This tree was not very large, and its leaves were not very lush, but the area it cast on the ground was very large. There were no spots of light, and it was so gloomy that it seemed like the true darkness of night. The young man was standing under the tree. Although the shadows were very thick, one could still clearly see that there was no demon horn on his head. It was no wonder that he had been able to enter the city so easily. "This is the final foothold of my divine race in White Emperor City? Bloody yellow sand. Rather interesting." The young man held his hands behind him as he looked around with interest, but it was hard to tell who he was talking to. If the White Emperor really isn't asleep, then it's too dangerous. "Quickly leave, military advisor." "Yes, Your Majesty." The wind slowly rustled the leaves, causing the shadows to sway uneasily. It was like clothes, but also like someone was speaking. In the courtyard covered in yellow sand, the only person left was the young man, his hands held behind him. He raised his head to the sky. The winter sun shone on his face. His face was rather pale, and he did not seem very healthy. He narrowed his eyes. Hands held behind his back, looking at the sky, narrowing his eyes. It seemed like all the important figures of the world liked this sort of action. Yes, this young man from Shualao City was a truly important figure. He was the young demon lord that Chen Chongqing had met in the snowy mountains. Chapter 946. The young demon lord stepped on the yellow sand, following the seemingly old golden bloodstains as he walked towards a certain place. This was the back gate of the courtyard. The iron lock was covered in rust, as if it had not been opened for many years. It seemed very ordinary. If there was anything special about it, it was probably the 2 stone statues on the side of the stone step. These 2 statues were probably of 2 men. They were completely naked, their bodies extremely perfect, and they had a pair of wings on their back. The stone statues had no expression, but they gave off a lifelike aura, as if they could come to life at any moment. If those elders of the demi-human race who had lived for countless years saw them, they might associate them with the gods of their tribal myths. But in the demon lord's eyes, these 2 stone statues were some sort of taboo, brimming with loathing and wariness. In truth, he was very familiar with these 2 stone statues. When he was very young, he had seen them in the Stone of the Gods in the deepest part of the Demon Palace. He did not find it strange that these 2 stone statues had suddenly come from Shualao City's Demon Palace to White Emperor City. This was because on that night during the sacrifice to the starry sky, he had personally seen those 2 pillars of light break through the wall and pour into these 2 stone statues. As he thought of something, the demon lord's face paled. After a while, he returned to normal. He was still very wary and doubtful of the sacrifice to the starry sky, but the circumstances had forced him to accept Black Robe's proposal. But now that he saw with his own eyes these 2 lifeless stone statues, he once more began to doubt his choice. Father, your view might be correct. The starry sky can kill, can help us kill, and can also kill us. The demon lord gazed at the 2 stone statues, his hands behind his back slowly caressing an object made of stone. He slowly said, "But father, be at ease. I will not treat them as members of the same race. I will only use them as hunting dogs. If there comes a day when they understand, I will destroy this object." If Chen Chongqing were present, he would probably recognize what the object in his hands was. On that night in the snowy mountains, it was precisely this object made of stone that had pierced the old demon lord's abdomen, drawing out that destructive pillar of light from that side of the starry sky. Luolua's palace was at the highest point of White Emperor City, even higher than the White Emperor couple's palace. This was because she liked to climb high and see far. Of course, this also showed how much the White Emperor and his wife doted on her. But today, the fog over White Emperor City was even thicker than usual. Standing by the window, it was very difficult to see too far. The light was rather gloomy, and all one could see was the familiar Red River and the green mountains on the opposite shore, the damp forests that seemed to smell, and the massive trees that loomed as high as the sky in the distance. These were the scenery she had seen for many years and was already used to, but for some reason, she felt a little unfamiliar today. Following that, she heard the noise coming from outside the palace. She heard the sound of war drums and sensed the aura of the wildfire stirred up by the beast dance. Was the ceremony really about to begin? She already knew what happened last night. On the surface, the Xiong clan leader and the other powerful figures appeared to be extremely domineering, but she understood that this was all a facade. In yesterday's battle between the divine domains, it was clear that his mother had obtained victory. Her prestige and momentum were at their strongest. Whether it was the chief elder or the other powerful figures of the demi-human race, other than clenching their axes and saying rebellion, there was nothing they could do to make his mother yield. What made her feel even sadder was that great elder clearly sensed her father's will. This meant that her father also knew of this matter. Last night, before leaving the imperial palace, the chief elder had come to see her. He had sworn a blood oath to ensure her safety, but he had said nothing about today's events. The heavenly selection ceremony would proceed as usual. Just like the raindrops falling from the sky, she was about to be married, and this could not be changed. Just who did her mother want her to marry? Why was she so confident that the person she chose would definitely be chosen by the ancestral spirit and endure the baptism of the heavenly flame in the heart of the tree? Luoluo gazed out the window at the extremely vigilant Red River Beast Guard as she pondered these questions. Last night, because she had been thinking about many things and arranging her future plans, she had not slept well, so her complexion was rather poor. Guardian Li looked at her face and believed that she was suffering from insomnia because of her grief. She could not suppress her pity and her eyes became moist. Through the tunnel? Guardian Li brought a cup of acorn tea to Luoluo and whispered, "I've already obtained the key." Luoluo lightly shook her head. "Those sky silkworms underground are not easy to deal with." Guardian Li paled at the mention of the sky silkworms. She gave up on this plan and began to think of other ways to escape. Luoluo had not spoken the truth. The sky silkworms were the guardians of the abyss beneath White Emperor City. They possessed terrifying killing power and could freely travel through the abyss and mud. From a certain perspective, they could perfectly prevent any enemy from infiltrating through the ground. But she had already tried 3 years ago, and the sky silkworms had been unable to stop her. She rubbed the small stone tied to her neck. When she thought of how the sky silkworms had fled in fear, she happily laughed. Guardian Li had no idea that this small stone was the legendary heavenly tome monolith. Seeing her laugh, she believed that she was too frightened and panicked, not knowing what to do. Only after Luoluo said a few comforting words did Guardian Li calm down. Yes, even if she was heavily guarded by those valiant Red River Beast Guard, even if White Emperor City was secretly protected by seals, it would not be very difficult for her to escape. In the eyes of Madame Mu, in the eyes of the Xiang clan leader and the other elders, in the eyes of those demi-human generals and ministers, Princess Luoheng had not diligently cultivated the imperial clan's techniques in the last few years. Her strength had advanced at an extremely slow pace, and she was still as delicate as she had been before she went to the capital. No one knew that she had always been very diligent in cultivation. Just like her teacher, she would wake up at 5 o'clock every day, close her eyes to meditate for 5 seconds, and then get up to wash her face and eat. After that, she would begin to meditate until late at night and fall asleep. Yes, her cultivation speed in the imperial clan's techniques was very ordinary, even somewhat slow, but this was not because she lacked comprehension or because the problem with her meridians had not been resolved. It was because she spent the vast majority of her time completing the assignments her teacher had given her. To put it another way, she spent the vast majority of her time studying the path of the sword. Besides the heavenly tome monoliths and her increasingly powerful cultivation in the path of the sword, she also had many powerful magical artifacts left behind by her father. It was not difficult at all for her to scare away those heaven silkworms underground. Her sorrow came more from the fact that in a few more days, she might not be able to see the scenery outside the stone window again. Yes, if nothing else happened, if her teacher could not make it to White Emperor City in time, then she could only leave by herself. Suddenly, an extremely sharp, even somewhat grating sound came from outside the stone window. It was the sound of the air being torn into shreds, the sound of a seal being forcefully broken by a high-speed object. Then, tensome grunts came from outside the hall. The dust on the ground stirred up, the cool breeze suddenly vanished, and a figure appeared. The edges of this person's fluttering clothes carried the afterimages of the air vibrating at high speed. From this, one could imagine just how fast this person had come. This person wore a rather old gown, the pattern of copper coins concealed within it. His face had a very indifferent expression, just like that of an ordinary wealthy man. If one noticed the yellow dirt on his boots, one might even mistake him for a landlord from the countryside who liked to personally farm. Chapter 947. Guardian Jean, why have you come? Guardian Li was both shocked and worried at the sight of this person. The newcomer was Jean Yulu. This was the fastest demi-human great general in the world and the most experienced demi-human. Back then, he had followed Luoluo to the capital to study and had even served as a gatekeeper in the Orthodox Academy for a very long time. After returning to the demi-human realm, he had not returned to the court, but had continued his life of farming all the way until now. Luoluo and Xianyuan Pa had both tried to contact him, but to no avail, as his estate had always been under strict surveillance. For him to be able to leave the estate and come to the imperial palace today, those unconscious guards and maids outside the hall, was proof of how he had done all this. Outside the hall, please follow me, Jean Yulu said to Luoluo. As the fastest expert in the world and the most senior great general of the demi-human race, even if the imperial palace was heavily guarded and spies were everywhere, if he left with Luoluo, he really might have a chance. Guardian Li looked at Luoluo, her eyes also brimming with persuasion. At most, Empress will only punish me. She will not make things too difficult for me. Luoluo took Jean Yulu's hand, her face full of gratitude, but she did not agree to his request. Instead, she whispered a few words. Quickly leave through the tunnel in the back of the hall. She wanted to hand over the magical artifacts her father had left for her to Jean Yulu so that he would have a chance to leave through the tunnel. But before she could finish speaking, the clouds in the blue sky gathered together like a flock of sheep being led by a shepherd, blocking out the sun and shrouding all of White Emperor City in shadow. Madame Mu walked into the stone hall and calmly said to Jean Yulu, "Even a child knows that it's impossible, so why must you do this?" After a moment of silence, Jean Yulu said, "On what basis does Empress intend to kill me? Trespassing on the imperial palace or disrespecting a saint?" Madame Mu replied, "Your prestige in the tribe is too high. Not even His Majesty can lightly kill you, much less me. I just don't understand why you've been so hostile to His Majesty all these years and have targeted me so many times. Have we not been lenient enough?" Jean Yulu replied, "His Majesty naturally understands what happened in the past, and Empress should also understand what happened today." Madame Mu replied, "You should be well aware that this was not my intention alone. Last night, the chief elder sensed His Majesty's will. That's why I'm different from old Xiang and the other elders. Maybe that's why His Majesty never liked me." Jean Yulu impassively said to Madame Mu, "Even if this is His Majesty's decree, as long as I believe it to be wrong, I will still not accept it." Madame Mu replied, as expected of Guardian Jean, "Putting aside the crime of disobeying an edict, just how do you determine whether it is right or wrong?" Jean Yulu said, 800 miles of the Red River and 10,000 miles of the Yao domain. How can we hand them over to someone who is not of our race?" Madame Mu explained, "The so-called heavenly selection is the will of the ancestral spirit. No matter what race one is from, as long as one is accepted by the celestial trees and baptized by the wildfire, one's bloodline will completely transforming into the true body of the demi-human emperor and henceforth become a member of the White Emperor clan. How could one be considered an outsider?" Jean Yulu looked into her eyes and said, "This is your arrangement for the second prince?" Madame Mu replied, "All the people participating in the heavenly selection ceremony must obey the arrangements of fate, and this is the fairest method." Jean Yulu asked, "You suddenly announced this matter so suddenly that the human race had no time to respond or send anyone to participate. What sort of fairness is this?" Madame Mu indifferently said, "What does this have to do with Guardian Jean? Are you colluding with the people of Zhou?" Jean Yulu sternly said, "What do you think of Her Highness? She is the disciple of His Holiness the Pope, so she might also be colluding with the people of Zhou? So even though you clearly know that her meridians have already been repaired and that she only needs enough time to smoothly inherit the throne, you still insist on forcefully activating the heavenly selection ceremony?" Madame Mu replied, I understand her situation better than any of you. I hope that she can obtain happiness, but I will not give her any misconceptions." Jin Yu asked, "Misconceptions or lies? Empress, these words of yours can't even deceive yourself, so how can you convince Her Highness?" They did not try to hide their words from Luoluo, so Luoluo could clearly hear them. With these final words, the stone hall became abnormally quiet. At this point, it was no longer possible to continue the conversation. Madame Mu lightly waved her sleeve and flipped her jade hand. A gust of wind blew through the stone hall, and a massive hand condensed from clear light slapped at Jin Yu. Countless ear-piercing screeches resounded through the hall, the air jolted into countless turbulences. Jin Yu transformed into a blur, avoiding the massive hand and retreating off the stone platform. Madame Mu's expression did not change. She took a step forward, her sleeve flapping once more. The white clouds gathered over White Emperor City suddenly descended several li, becoming extremely low as if they wanted to approach the mountains on the opposite shore. Those with good eyesight could even see the droplets of rain gathering in the clouds. As the clouds descended, an unimaginable pressure descended, enveloping White Emperor City, especially the stone hall at the highest point. A groan came from the platform, and the blur behind Jin Yu that seemed to melt into the world paused. He was extremely strong, but if he wanted to contend against an expert of the divine domain, he needed to push his speed to the limit for even a sliver of a chance. But Madame Mu only needed a wave of her sleeve to borrow the might of the world and the pressure of the clouds to break his movement technique. The clouds in the sky were getting closer and closer to the ground. The towering trees on the opposite shore of the Red River were almost completely gone, and the pressure falling on the stone hall was getting stronger and stronger. The unconscious guards and maids began to moan in pain, and Guardian Li found it extremely difficult to breathe. Jin Yu's figure was getting clearer and clearer. The clearer the blur, the slower he was. The moment his figure completely appeared, Jin Yu would receive Madame Mu's thunderous strike. This scene did not happen, because Luoluo had walked to Madame Mu's side. She pulled on Madame Mu's sleeve, raised her small face, and opened her eyes wide as she very seriously said a few words. "Mother, please don't be like this." The black clouds pressed down on the city, but the city was not destroyed. Without even a drop of rain falling, they returned to the sky and gradually dispersed. Jin Yu had fled the imperial palace, presumably unable to return to the fields he had cultivated for so many years. No one knew where he had gone. Guardian Li and the guards and maids withdrew, leaving the stone hall in absolute silence. Only Madame Mu and Luoluo remained. "Many people think that I'm doing this for my own selfish desires." Madame Mu looked into Luoluo's eyes and asked, "Do you also think this way?" Luoluo was quiet for a very long time. She did not directly answer this question, but asked a rather strange question. "Mother, after all these years, do you still miss home?" Chapter 948. Anyone would miss home. Even when Luoluo had spent the happiest years of her life in the capital's Orthodox Academy, she would often miss home. She missed her father, she missed her mother, she missed those big fellows in the Red River, and she missed those birds on the celestial tree. Of course, she didn't think it was wrong, but very good. At the very least, it seems that you're willing to believe that I'm not acting for my own selfish desires, even though you now believe that I'm acting for the great Western continent. Madame Mu calmly looked at her and said, "I do not deny that the great Western continent is my home, but your maternal grandfather and grandmother have both passed away. Do you think I would value the great Western continent more than White Emperor City? The rumors are all false. Why would I let you marry your cousin?" Luoluo was shocked when she heard this. Although she had no actual authority, she was still the only princess of the demi-human race and had an extremely high status in White Emperor City. Moreover, people like the Xiong clan leader of the Council of Elders had doted on her ever since she was a child. Even if she did not ask around, many things could not be hidden from her. For instance, she easily learned that the source of this rumor was a certain guard of the Abyssal Pearl Pavilion, and this guard was Madame Mu's most loyal subordinate. Because of this, she never thought that the rumor would be wrong. Her mother didn't want her to marry her cousin? Then why had the great Western Continent's diplomatic mission come? Why had the great elder sent someone this morning to inform him that his second cousin's name had already entered the list of participants in the heavenly selection ceremony? This is your father's and my idea. For safety reasons, we haven't told anyone, including you. Madame Mu said, in a little while, the heavenly selection ceremony will begin. I think it's about time to tell you. Luoluo asked, Mother, what is it? Madame Mu rubbed her head and said, Of course it's still about your marriage. Luoluo was very nervous and inexplicably uneasy. What Guardian Jean said is naturally correct, and the great elder is also not wrong. You yourself are naturally even clearer. His Holiness the Pope truly did repair your meridians. As long as you are given enough time, you will definitely be able to cultivate the techniques of the White Emperor clan to the highest level and become the next White Emperor. Madame Mu solemnly said, But your father and I are both very worried that there is not enough time. Luoluo said, I don't understand what you mean. Madame Mu said, You are the only princess of the demi-human race. You should do something for this place. Luoluo understood and fell silent. From a very young age, she knew that she had to bear the responsibility. Chen Chongsheng was also very clear about this, so he never asked her to do anything. If the demi-human race's situation was not good, she would have to make contributions, and there was not much time for her to mature into the new White Emperor. Then she should be like those princesses in the past tens of thousands of years, seeking benefits for the demon clan through marriage. This was her marriage, an alliance marriage. Her mother had done the same thing back then. Marry into Shuilao City, Madame Mu said as she looked into Luoluo's eyes. All the puzzles were solved at this moment. Luoluo's face instantly turned pale as she whispered, Why? Madame Mu said, The demon lord of this generation is truly an extraordinary individual. Only he is worthy of you. Luoluo said, Mother, you know I'm not asking about this. This was not a simple marriage. It was not a matter of sex, and it was not a matter of equal social status. Why? Of course it's for the future of the demi-human race. Madame Mu looked into her eyes and said, At present, the human race's luck is flourishing. I originally thought that after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, with the successive deaths of the storms of the 8 directions, the human race would have a period of peace. Who could have expected that in just a few short years, Wang Pe, the Mountly sect master, and the Prince of Xiang would all break through? Moreover, Mao Qiyu is already at the threshold, and there's also Liang Wangsun and Xiao Zhang, your teacher, Su Yorong and Qiu Shanjun. The number of experts of the human race will quickly recover, perhaps even surpass what it was in the past. Coupled with Shang Xingzhou's methods, who on the continent will be a match for them? What will they do after they exterminate the demons? Are you willing to see the people of the demi-human race kneel before the iron hooves of the humans? Luoluo was quiet for a while, then said, The demons are probably more worried about these things than we are. Madame Mu replied, Correct, so we need not doubt Shuilao City's sincerity and resolve. Luoluo raised her head and asked, But what about the hatred between the two sides? Mother, how will you convince the Council of Elders, the ministers, and the generals? Madame Mu replied, I've already convinced many people. Crucially, I've already convinced your father, so who would dare to oppose? Luoluo thought about how the chief elder had not seen her father when he entered the mountain last night, but had returned with a massive change in attitude. She vaguely guessed at something. But this was not enough to convince her. Moreover, just as Madame Mu had said, perhaps no one in the demi-human race would dare to oppose this marriage, but she could. She looked at Madame Mu and said, If it's for the future of the demi-human race, given my relationship with teacher, the orthodoxy will assuredly support us. When the time comes, even if the great Zhou imperial court wants to send soldiers to attack, it will first have to resolve its internal problems. Madame Mu said, "First, you must be sure that your teacher Chen Chongqing can obtain victory in this war. Moreover, you must be sure that he and Shang Xingzhou, master and disciple, are truly enemies, and not some scheme to deceive us and Xuelao City." Lu Luo replied, "Teacher is not that sort of person. It's already been 5 years since the two of you met. 5 years is enough time to change many things. Moreover, even if the two of you are master and disciple, compared to the greater powers of the world, this relationship is still not stable enough. Perhaps it's strong enough to affect the relationship between the human race and the demi-human race. You understand what I mean?" Madame Mu tenderly said, "Unless he is willing to abandon Su Yorong and marry you. In that case, I will immediately end the heavenly selection ceremony." Luoluo opened her eyes wide and innocently said, "How could teacher marry me? I'm his student." Madame Mu smirked at her. "Do you only treat him as teacher?" Luoluo nodded. "Of course." Madame Mu rubbed her head and said, "Silly child, even if you can deceive me, how can you deceive yourself?" The morning breeze blew in through the window, carrying with it the unique smell of lime from the beast dances and the increasingly intense, or perhaps cheerful, beating of the drums. Madame Mu left. She wanted to go to the myriad beast platform in front of the imperial palace to preside over today's heavenly selection ceremony. Luoluo sat in front of the stone window, somewhat discouraged. Dejectedly, she began to tear at the gardenia flowers she had picked this morning. Just like what Madame Mu had said before she left, even if she could deceive everyone in the continent, how could she deceive herself? Chapter 949. Guardian Li walked in and looked at her, wanting to say something but hesitating. Luoluo knew what she was thinking and softly said, "Mother and I think differently. That would be of no benefit to the great Western continent." Guardian Li sadly said, "Does your Highness really have to be married off to such a distant place?" It had been more than 2,000 years since a demi-human princess had been married off to Xuelao City. Luoluo silently thought, if this really can prevent wars from erupting, perhaps it really is a good thing, and also good for teacher. But that young demon lord probably would not participate in the heavenly selection ceremony, so what was the liveliness outside the palace? Even if that young demon lord wanted to marry her, he would not remain in White Emperor City to wait to inherit the throne. So, how would this story end? The great Western continent's diplomatic mission had arrived, and the heavenly selection ceremony had begun. The celestial trees on the two shores of the Red River, deep in the clouds, began to drone. Although it was rumored that the Empress had chosen the second prince of the great Western continent as husband for Princess Luoluo, many young demi-human experts still left the forest that very night and set out for White Emperor City. The vast majority of them had arrived at White Emperor City several days ago and had made their preparations. Since the Council of Elders had succeeded in having this matter proceed according to the rules of the demi-human race, anyone could be chosen. As long as one could become a candidate, the rest would be left to the wildfire of the celestial trees and left to the ancestral spirits to choose. Would the ancestral spirits of the tribes favor the outsiders of the great Western continent? In the early morning, the morning sun was unable to tear through the thick fog shrouding the two shores of the Red River. The sky was still dim, but White Emperor City was already awake. The rhythmic beating of war drums resounded from every place. The demi-humans of different tribes prostrated themselves to those massive trees in the distance, bowed, and then began to dance. As the sacrificial ceremony continued, the figures of the 9 giant trees gradually became clearer. Although they were dozens of miles away, they could feel that the temperature had risen a lot. It was as if many invisible flames were rising from the ground and spreading along the bodies of the giant trees into the world. To the sound of different war drums, the banners of different tribes waved in the streets of White Emperor City. Young experts from the vast demi-human domain, accompanied by their fathers and companions, walked out of the meeting houses of their tribes, their faces filled with hope and nervousness as they made their way to the imperial palace at the highest point. The crowd gradually congregated, a dense sea of people, yet there was no noise, only a palpitating silence. In the deepest part of this silent sea, there was a carriage that was very eye-catching. This was because this carriage did not carry an ordinary banner, but a royal banner, flapping in the wind. Countless gazes fell on the carriage. No matter how confident and arrogant the young experts of the various tribes were, they all subconsciously revealed expressions of awe when they saw the royal flag. This was because the royal flag represented the most powerful aristocratic clan in the southern part of the Yao region, and because a man was sitting under the royal flag. The man's expression was indifferent. His black hair fluttered in the wind, and a yellow light occasionally flashed in his eyes. The aura emitted from his body was extremely powerful, even a little terrifying. He was the most talented demi-human expert in the last 200 years. After Wang Pa had broken through and Xiao Zhang had been placed on the wanted list, his position on the Proclamation of Liberation had already risen to third place. Xiaoda was his name and Shi was his surname. He represented the will of the southern demi-human race. More importantly, his own will was extremely formidable, and the entire continent knew that in the last few years, his most resolute will had been to marry Princess Luo Luo and become the next White Emperor. To no one's surprise, he, who had remained silent in the turmoil of the last few days, had finally appeared. An expert of this level was about to participate in the heavenly selection ceremony. Just who could be his match? The second prince of the great western continent had long since woken up. After washing up, he held a book in his hands and seemed to have heard something. After a few moments of silence, the corners of his lips perked up into an incomprehensible smile. He put down the book, took a bright yellow belt, and walked out of the imperial palace. The thick fog did not disperse, seeming to fuse with the yellow sand on the ground. The young demon lord was not sleeping in his room. Instead, he was lying on the sand, his hands behind his head, one leg crossed, and his eyes closed. He seemed particularly at ease. If his identity was known, he would definitely be surrounded and killed. However, he didn't seem to care about this at all. The increasingly loud sound of the war drums didn't affect him at all. After an unknown period of time, he opened his eyes, got up, brushed off the yellow sand on his body, and walked to the back door. He calmly gazed at the two stone statues, took a bamboo hat, put it on his head, and then left. The two stone statues had also disappeared. Their original positions were empty, with only the sand gently blown about by the morning breeze, ultimately burying yesterday's golden blood. Xian Yuanpa had woken up very early. To be more precise, he had not slept much last night. Because of that incomprehensible couple in the room, he had sat in the courtyard for an entire night. But his lack of sleep had nothing to do with his lack of comfort. It was just that he was rather nervous about what was about to happen. The beating of the war drums was so clear, each sound urging him to set out on his journey. But before this, he still had some things to do. This was a habit he had developed from following Chen Chongqing in the Orthodox Academy. The more important the matter, the calmer he had to be. Even if he could not calm his mind, he had to at least complete the most important task. He opened the door and walked in. Through the paper door, he asked, "I'm going to buy breakfast. What do you want to eat?" 9 massive celestial trees were faintly discernible in the fog, exuding invisible yet incomparably real waves of heat. There were no gales from the western sea, but the Red River began to surge with massive waves. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was so loud that it inspired fear in anyone who heard it. No demi-human felt fear. They knew that this was the disturbance caused by the massive monsters that lived in the Red River. The massive monsters that lived in the Red River were called the Jings. They had unimaginably massive bodies, but they had an extremely gentle temperament. They fed on the red algae that grew endlessly in the river and never harmed any living creature. They were viewed by the demi-humans as protectors. The massive waves in the Red River today were the Jings sensing the change in the wildfire and celebrating. White Emperor City was also a scene of celebration. Although they were still rather uneasy about the rumor and the tense situation of the last 2 days, the heavenly selection ceremony was still a rare occasion for the demi-human race. The populace threw these emotions to the back of their minds and began to dance to the incessant beating of the war drums. The hundreds of stone walls that were used to divide the streets were filled with demonic citizens. It looked like the stone walls had been raised overnight, but it was not neat enough. The citizens looked at the youths who were walking towards the arenas, waving their arms, shouting, and jumping. The new stone walls seemed to be a few centimeters taller. It truly felt like the entire world was celebrating. Chapter 950. The Heavenly Selection Ceremony was the most important event of the demi-human race, but the related sacrificial ceremony was extremely simple, very much in line with the demi-human race's usual temperament. The morning light had just driven away some of the fog when the sacrificial ceremony came to an end, and the truly important and attention-grabbing formal process began. The formal process was similarly simple, divided into 3 stages. The first was the selection of 9 people with the right to enter the celestial tree through the fighting arena. After that, the 9 candidates would enter the ground through the trunk of the celestial tree. They would be bathed in wildfire and undergo the ancestral spirits test. If more than one candidate passed this test, then they would have to fight again until the final victor was chosen. This would be the so-called Heaven's Chosen One. If one carefully analyzed the entire process, one could see the painstaking efforts of the ancestors of the demi-human race from countless years ago. If it was just to simplify matters, when the rules of the heavenly selection were established, the second stage, the trial of the ancestral spirits, could have been placed at the last stage. The current sequence showed that the heavenly selection ultimately depended on one's own strength. For the demi-human race to survive in such a savage and dangerous environment and gradually grow stronger, they had never relied on the protection of their ancestors or the mercy of the heavens, but on their will to overcome the heavens. Based on these ideals, even though they knew that they had no chance of becoming the final victor, many young tribal experts had still participated in today's heavenly selection ceremony. Several dozen fighting platforms were scattered across the different districts and tribal settlements of White Emperor City, awaiting the arrival of these warriors. The Carp tribe, which was the best at counting and the most impartial among the demi-humans, sent many experienced and prudent members to judge the outcome. The imperial court of the demi-humans and the council of elders sent supervising officials to record the entire process of what happened in each arena and could raise questions at any time. All the demi-human commoners of White Emperor City had already left their houses and were making their way to the fighting platforms, preparing to witness this once-in-a-century spectacle. The fighting platforms that received the most attention were near the Imperial Palace and Heaven's Guard Pavilion. They were so packed that not even a drop of water could trickle through. These fighting platforms received the most attention because they were closest to the Imperial Palace's observation platform, so they were most easily noticed by the Empress and the important figures of the Council of Elders. Those who dared to ascend these platforms were naturally not mediocre people. They were assuredly able to see many famous figures, like Xiaoda. The crowd parted like the tide. Escorted by the tribal elders and experts, Xiaoda made his way to the fighting platform. Along the way, many people loudly cheered for him. The demi-human race worshipped the strong. As the publicly acknowledged supreme expert of the middle generation, Xiaoda enjoyed great prestige on the 2 shores of the Red River, and his tribe was also extremely powerful. He had many supporters in the demi-human court and the council of elders. In the view of many demi-human commoners, even if the Empress selfishly favored her nephew, the ultimate victor of this heavenly selection ceremony would still be him. Only a person like him had the right to marry Princess Luoluo, had the right to become the next sovereign of the demi-human race. Xiaoda walked onto the platform, glanced at his opponent, and expressionlessly said, "You're not my match." His temperament had always been cold and arrogant. Moreover, he was somewhat cruel and ruthless. Naturally, he would not be polite with his words. And this was because his temperament had changed a lot. Otherwise, he wouldn't even bother to talk to him. His opponent was a middle-aged expert of the Meng tribe. In any other fighting platform, he might have been able to go very far, but this middle-aged Meng tribe expert's luck was truly terrible. In his first match, he had actually encountered the legendary Xiaoda. It was hard to avoid some regret and unwillingness in the depths of his solemn eyes. Logically speaking, he should have conceded and retreated when he knew he was no match, but this middle-aged Meng tribe expert did not do this. This was because the demi-human race possessed an extremely valiant will to fight and valued their reputation above all else, even more than their lives. He said to Xiaoda, "If you retreat because you are not my match, then Sir will regret that you will not encounter any more challenges today." The Meng tribe expert's words expressed his respect for Xiaoda, as well as his attitude. The apathetic yellow luster in Xiaoda's eyes faded and a satisfied expression appeared on his face. "You're not bad. I will use my full strength." The Meng tribe expert was not alarmed by these words. On the contrary, he felt honored and said, "Thank you." Xiaoda took off his cloak and threw it outside the fighting platform. Looking at the Meng tribe expert, he said, "You first." Thus, the first match of the heavenly selection ceremony began without any novelty. The demi-human race did everything very directly, very simply, and also very violently, whether it was eating, doing business, engaging in political struggles, or truly fighting. Just like the countless battles that took place on the two shores of the Red River every day, today's match was also completely without novelty. Deafening collisions rang out incessantly, dust flew, the earth quaked, and the winds howled. The result of this match was also completely without novelty. Xiaoda naturally obtained victory, and he fulfilled the promise he had made before the match. His fists and legs did not hold back at all, his style berserk to the extreme. He only used 3 moves to heavily injure the Meng tribe expert. The blood on the sand-covered fighting platform was a ghastly sight. Many of the Meng tribe expert's bones had been broken. His eyes were closed, and he seemed like he could die at any moment. A demi-human court medical official hurried to the platform with several military doctors and medicine chests, but the Meng tribe expert's injuries were so severe that he could not stop the bleeding even after a long while. If this were any other sacrificial ceremony or match, the Taoist Church of the Western Wastes would naturally send priests. The sacred light technique had a miraculous effect in treating injuries like this and could presumably save the Meng tribe expert's life. However, today was the heavenly selection ceremony. The orthodoxy was already considering the greater picture by not making trouble, so how could they send priests to help? Seeing that the Meng tribe expert was on the verge of death, the cheers around the fighting platform gradually died down and became rather quiet. The demi-human race respected experts the most and loved fighting the most, so they had seen this sort of scene many times. But when they thought about how this Meng tribe expert of clearly extraordinary strength was about to die, the crowd couldn't help but feel rather strange. After you cure him, remember to tell him that he still has to pay for his medicine. Xiaoda suddenly threw an earthen yellow pill into the hands of the demi-human court medical official and expressionlessly said, then walked off the fighting platform. The demi-human court medical official froze at the sight of the earthen yellow pill, and then an expression of disbelief appeared on his face. The crowd around the fighting platform began to whisper to each other, and then to shout in shock. Could that be a yellow tree thorn? It can't be, right? The yellow tree thorn was a pill brewed from the sap of a rare plant in the south of the demi-human domain. It had the miraculous effect of staunching blood and reviving the soul. It was produced in very small quantities and was extremely precious. Other than the few pills sent to the imperial palace and the council of elders every year, the vast majority of the world's yellow tree thorns were under the control of the landowning households. As an expert that had been raised and supported by the entire Shur clan, Xiaoda naturally carried yellow tree thorns on him. However, no one could have imagined that after heavily injuring the Meng clan expert, he would so generously use such a precious pill to save his life. The crowd was stunned to the extreme as Xiaoda walked out of the fighting platform. They felt that his figure was even larger than the rumors made it out to be. No matter how scorching the gazes from the crowd were, no matter how much reverence there was in the discussions, Xiaoda's expression did not change. It was still indifferent. The fighting platform continued. There was still some time before his next match. He passed through the crowd and returned to his carriage, escorted by the experts of his tribe. The clan leader had been sitting in the carriage the entire time. As he gazed at Xiaoda, the expression on the clan leader's face was rather strange, gratified and indifferent, but also somewhat confused. "You've changed a lot in these last few years." Xiaoda fell quiet for a while, then replied, "Change is because there is a reason for change.